They say that Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was forged over centuries in the heat of battle. If you have ever stood before the ruins of the Forum, or looked upon the Hadrian's wall and wondered how a small village on the Tiber grew to govern the known world, then this story is for you. In this comprehensive documentary, we are not just looking at dates and names. We are tracing the very heartbeat of Western civilization through its greatest conflicts. By staying with us throughout this journey, you will discover the tactical evolution, how the Roman legion evolved from a simple citizen militia into the world's first professional military machine, the clash of titans, the desperate struggle against Hannibal, the strategic brilliance of Julius Caesar in Gaul, and the forgotten wars of the East, the resilience of Rome, how the empire survived plagues, internal betrayals, and the collapse of its western half, only to endure for another 1,000 years in Constantinople. The final legacy, how the Roman way of war eventually gave way to the age of gunpowder, forever changing the map of the Europe we live in today. Join me as we walk through 2,000 years of history, from the first iron sword to the final great stone walls. This is the story of the wars that shaped our world. The struggle for Latium and the Samnite Wars. The story of the Roman Empire does not begin with emperors or vast Mediterranean fleets, but with a series of grueling seasonal conflicts in the rugged hills and plains of central Italy. To understand the Roman military machine that would later crush Carthage and Macedonia, one must first look at the 4 centuries of persistent warfare that transformed a small city-state on the Tiber into the master of the Italian peninsula. The political and social landscape of early Italy. In the 4th century BCE, Italy was a mosaic of distinct cultures, languages, and military traditions. To the north lay the sophisticated but declining Etruscan city-states. To the south, the prosperous Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. And in the mountainous interior, the fierce, Oscan-speaking hill tribes. Rome at this time was a republic in its adolescence. It was a society defined by the struggle of the orders, a domestic political conflict between the patrician aristocracy and the plebeian commoners. This internal tension fueled external expansion, as land became the primary currency for social peace. A Roman citizen soldier did not fight for a wage. He fought for the survival of his farm and the glory of his lineage. The Roman army of this era was not yet the professional force of the Caesars. It was a militia based on property classes. Men provided their own equipment, and the army was reorganized from the rigid Greek-style phalanx into the more flexible manipular system during this period, a direct result of the lessons learned in the brutal terrain of the Apennines. The First Samnite War, 343 to 341 BCE. The Samnites were perhaps the most formidable opponents Rome ever faced in Italy. They were a confederation of 4 tribes, the Hirpini, Caudini, Caraceni, and Pentri, who inhabited the rugged highlands of Samnium. Unlike the urbanized Romans, the Samnites were a pastoral people, accustomed to high-altitude endurance and guerrilla tactics. The Casus Belli. The conflict was sparked not by a direct attack on Rome, but by the Samnites' expansion into the fertile plains of Campania. The Sidicini tribe and the wealthy city of Capua found themselves under Samnite pressure. Capua, unable to defend itself, appealed to Rome. Initially, Rome hesitated due to a pre-existing treaty with the Samnites. However, according to the historian Livy, the Campanians made a formal surrender, deditio, of their city to Rome, making Capua Roman property. Rome was now legally obligated to defend its new possession against its former Samnite allies. The commanders. Marcus Valerius Corvus, a legendary Roman consul known for his composure and bravery. Aulus Cornelius Cossus, his colleague in the consulship. The Battle of Mount Gaurus, 343 BCE. The first major encounter took place near Mount Gaurus, close to Cumae. Valerius Corvus led his legions against a Samnite force that was equal in number and ferocity. The terrain was uneven, favoring the Samnite infantry. Opening phases. The two lines crashed together with a violence that surprised both sides. For hours, neither side yielded. The Samnites, protected by their large rectangular shields and armed with heavy javelins, held their ground against the Roman thrusts. The Roman push. Valerius, seeing his men tiring, rode to the front ranks to lead a charge personally. He exhorted the infantry, reminding them that they fought for the very existence of the Republic's new influence in the south. The breakthrough. The Roman discipline eventually wore down the Samnite resolve. The Samnites retreated, not in a rout, but in a grudging withdrawal. When asked later why they fled, Samnite survivors reportedly said the eyes of the Romans seemed to burn with a fire they could not endure. While Rome won the First Samnite War, the peace was temporary. A revolt among Rome's Latin allies, the Latin War, forced a quick settlement, leaving the Samnite base of power largely intact. The Second Great Samnite War, 326-304 BCE. The Second Samnite War was a 20-year struggle for the heart of Italy. It was during this conflict that Rome suffered one of its most humiliating defeats in history. The disaster at the Caudine Forks, 321 BCE. Under the command of the brilliant Samnite general Gavius Pontius, the Samnites set a trap. They disguised soldiers as shepherds and fed the Roman consuls, Titus Veturius Calvinus and Spurius Postumus Albinus, false information that the Samnites were besieging a Roman ally in Apulia. The Roman army, consisting of two full consular legions, approximately 20,000 men, took the shortest route through the Caudine Forks, a narrow forested pass between two steep mountains. The trap. As the vanguard reached the far end of the pass, they found it blocked by a massive barricade of trees and boulders. When they turned to retreat, they found the entrance similarly sealed. The Romans were caught in a geographic cul-de-sac. The surrender. High on the ridges, the Samnite archers and slingers looked down upon the trapped legions. There was no room to deploy into battle formation. Starvation set in. The consuls were forced to surrender without a single sword being drawn. The yoke. Gavius Pontius forced every Roman soldier, including the consuls, to pass under the yoke, a humiliating ritual where defeated soldiers walked beneath a crossbar of spears, stripped of their armor and dignity, symbolizing their status as conquered cattle. The Roman reconstruction. The defeat at Caudine Forks did not break Rome, it transformed it. The Romans realized that the traditional phalanx was useless in mountain passes. They finalized the transition to the Manipular Legion. The Manipular system. Instead of one solid block, the legion was divided into 30 small units called maniples. These function like the joints of an arm, allowing the line to bend, break, and reform around obstacles or uneven terrain. The Battle of Lautulae, 315 BCE. Rome's recovery was slow. In 315 BCE, they suffered another defeat at Lautulae, where the Samnites nearly cut the Roman territory in half. The Samnites advanced as far as Latium, threatening the city itself. However, Rome's resilience lay in its manpower and its ability to build infrastructure during wartime. The Appian Way, 312 BCE. During the height of the war, the censor Appius Claudius began construction of the Via Appia. This was not merely a road, it was a military supply line that allowed Rome to move troops and grain into Samnium regardless of the season. It was the first superhighway of the ancient world, ensuring that the Roman war machine could be sustained indefinitely. The Battle of Centenarium, 295 BCE. By the Third Samnite War, the Samnites had realized they could not defeat Rome alone. They formed a massive, great coalition, including the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and the Senoan Gauls from the north. This was an existential threat to Rome. The terrain. The Pyrrhic War and the arrival of the elephant, 280 to 275 BCE. With the Samnites subdued,
Rome's shadow stretched toward the heel of Italy. This expansion brought the Republic into direct contact with the wealthy, sophisticated Greek city-states of Magna Graecia. The most powerful of these was Tarentum, modern Toronto, a Spartan colony and a major maritime power. The spark of conflict. The peace between Rome and Tarentum was governed by an old treaty forbidding Roman warships from entering the Gulf of Tarentum. In 282 BCE, however, Rome dispatched a small fleet to assist the city of Thurii. The Tarentines, viewing this as a blatant violation of their sovereignty, attacked the ships, sinking several and capturing others. When a Roman embassy arrived to demand restitution, the Tarentines reportedly insulted the ambassadors, mocking their Latin-accented Greek and, according to some accounts, even soiling their togas. Rome declared war. Tarentum, realizing it could not face the Roman legions alone, turned to the most famous mercenary king of the Hellenistic world, Pyrrhus of Epirus. The arrival of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was a second cousin to Alexander the Great and was considered by many, including later by Hannibal, to be the finest tactician of his age. He arrived in Italy in 280 BCE with a professional Hellenistic army, 20,000 phalangites, infantry armed with the 20-foot sarissa pike, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 archers, 500 slingers, and a terrifying psychological weapon, 20 war elephants. The armies compared. The Epirote phalanx, a rigid, impenetrable wall of pikes designed for flat terrain. The Roman legion, now fully adapted to the manipular system, utilizing the pilum, heavy javelin, and the gladius, short sword, emphasizing flexibility and individual initiative. The Battle of Heraclea, 280 BCE. The first encounter between the Roman legions and the Greek phalanx took place near the river Siris. The Roman consul, Publius Valerius Levinus, commanded roughly 30,000 men. The river crossing. Levinus attempted to surprise Pyrrhus by forcing a crossing of the river. The Roman cavalry successfully pushed back the Greek scouts, allowing the legions to deploy on the plain. Infantry clash. The battle was a grueling stalemate. 7 times the lines surged forward and back. The Roman legionnaires tried to hack through the thicket of pikes with their swords, but the reach of the sarissai kept them at bay. Conversely, the phalanx could not shatter the disciplined Roman maniples. The Lucanian oxen. Seeing his infantry tiring, Pyrrhus unleashed his elephants. The Romans, who had never seen such creatures, called them Lucanian oxen. The horses of the Roman cavalry panicked and bolted, throwing the entire Roman line into chaos. The aftermath. Pyrrhus won the field, but at a staggering cost. The Romans lost 7,000 men, but Pyrrhus lost nearly 4,000 of his elite veterans, men he could not easily replace so far from home. The Battle of Asculum, 279 BCE. A year later, the two forces met again in the woods near Asculum. This battle lasted 2 days and highlighted the Roman ability to adapt to new threats. Day 1. The fighting took place in rough, wooded terrain. This favored the Romans as the trees broke the cohesion of the Greek phalanx. By nightfall, the battle was a draw. Day 2. Pyrrhus managed to draw the Romans out into more open ground. The Romans, desperate to counter the elephants, deployed specially designed anti-elephant wagons equipped with iron spikes, fire-bearing poles, and scythes. The result. The wagons were largely ineffective as the Greek light infantry, Pisiloi, neutralized them before the elephants reached the lines. Pyrrhus drove the Romans back to their camp. When congratulated on his victory, Pyrrhus famously remarked, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." This gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, a success won at such a devastating cost that it is tantamount to defeat. The Battle of Beneventum, 275 BCE. After a brief, unsuccessful campaign in Sicily against the Carthaginians, Pyrrhus returned to Italy for a final confrontation. He faced the consul Manius Curius Dentatus near the town of Malventum, which the Romans later renamed Beneventum, or Good Event. The strategy. Pyrrhus attempted a night march to surprise the Roman camp. However, his troops became lost in the dense woods, their torches flickered out, and they arrived at dawn exhausted and disorganized. The engagement. The counterattack. Dentatus, seeing the disorder of the Epirot troops, launched a vigorous assault. The turning point. Pyrrhus again brought forward his elephants. This time, the Romans were prepared. Instead of fleeing, they pelted the beasts with flaming javelins and arrows. One young elephant was wounded and began to cry out. Its mother, also in the line, panicked and turned to find her calf. The stampede. The panicked elephants turned and trampled through the Greek phalanx, shredding the pike formations from within. The Roman legions followed the chaos, driving Pyrrhus's army into a total rout. Consequences of the Pyrrhic War. Pyrrhus abandoned Italy, leaving Tarentum to fall to the Romans in 272 BCE. The significance of this war cannot be overstated. International recognition. The Mediterranean world was shocked. A barbarian city on the Tiber had defeated the greatest Hellenistic general of the age. Ptolemaic Egypt soon sought a formal alliance with Rome. Complete hegemony. Rome was now the undisputed master of the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River. The Roman character. The war demonstrated the Roman doggedness. Unlike other nations of the time, Rome did not sue for peace after a lost battle. They simply raised new legions and adapted their tactics until they won. Rome now stood as a major Mediterranean power. However, directly across the sea lay the North African city of Carthage, the greatest naval power in the Western world. The two were now on a collision course over the island of Sicily. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, the birth of a naval power. The conflict that would define the Roman trajectory more than any other was the struggle with Carthage, a Phoenician colony in modern-day Tunisia that had grown into a commercial and maritime titan. While the Roman strength lay in its citizen infantry, Carthage relied on a vast navy and a professional mercenary army funded by an empire of trade that spanned from Spain to Sicily. The origins, the Messana crisis. The war began not over grand strategy, but due to a localized dispute in Sicily. A band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines had seized the city of Messana, modern Messina. When Hero II of Syracuse moved to crush them, the Mamertines appealed first to Carthage and then to Rome. The Roman Senate was divided. Supporting mercenaries who had illegally seized the city was morally questionable, but allowing Carthage to occupy Messana, a city sitting directly on the straits separating Sicily from Italy, was a strategic nightmare. The Roman assembly, lured by the prospect of plunder, voted for intervention. The Siege of Agrigentum, 262 BCE. The first major land confrontation occurred at Agrigentum. Rome dispatched two consular armies, approximately 40,000 men. The strategy: the Romans did not assault the city directly, but built a double line of fortifications, circumvallation and contravallation, to starve the garrison while protecting themselves from a Carthaginian relief force. The battle. After 7 months, a Carthaginian relief army under Hanno arrived. In the ensuing battle, the Roman legions proved superior in the hand-to-hand grind of the infantry line. Agrigentum fell, and Rome sold the entire population of 25,000 into slavery. This victory changed the Roman objective. They no longer sought merely to protect Messana, they sought to drive Carthage out of Sicily entirely. To do that, they needed to conquer the sea. Innovation, the Corvus, and the Battle of Mylae, 260 BCE. Rome was not a seafaring nation. Legend has it they built their first fleet by dismantling a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme and using it as a blueprint. To compensate for their lack of maneuverability, Roman engineers invented the Corvus, the Raven. The Corvus, this was a heavy boarding bridge, about 36 feet long, with a massive iron spike on the underside. When a Roman ship pulled alongside or prow to prow with an enemy, the Corvus was dropped, the iron spike embedded into the enemy deck, locking the ships together and allowing Roman legionaries to swarm across. It turned a sea battle into a land battle. The Battle of Mylae. Under the consul Gaius Duilius, the Roman fleet met the Carthaginians. Expecting an easy victory over landlubbers, the Carthaginians charged in disorder. The corvus worked perfectly. The Romans captured or sank 50 Carthaginian ships, including the flagship. It was Rome's first major naval victory, celebrated by the erection of a columna rostrata, a column decorated with the beaks of captured ships, in the Roman Forum. The invasion of Africa and the disaster of Regulus, 256 to 255 BCE. In an attempt to end the war, Rome sent an expeditionary force to Africa under Marcus Attilius Regulus. The victory at Egnomus. To get there, they had to pass the Carthaginian fleet in what was perhaps the largest naval battle of antiquity, involving over 600 ships. Roman superior boarding tactics won the day. The hubris of Regulus. After initial successes in Africa, Regulus offered Carthage peace terms so harsh they were rejected. Carthage then hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus. The Battle of the Bagradas River, 255 BCE. Xanthippus recognized that the Romans were operating on a flat plain. He used his superior cavalry and 100 war elephants to envelop and crush the Roman legions. Regulus was captured, and the remnants of the Roman fleet were destroyed in a storm on the return journey, killing nearly 100,000 men in a single night. The stalemate and the Hamilcar Barca era. For the next decade, the war became a grueling conflict of attrition in western Sicily. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, father of the famous Hannibal, waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign from the mountaintops of Hircti and Eryx, harassing supply lines and refusing to be drawn into a pitched battle. Rome was nearly bankrupt. The state treasury was empty. In a final act of national will, the wealthiest Roman citizens pooled their private fortunes to fund one last fleet of 200 quinqueremes. The Battle of the Aegates Islands, 241 BCE. The final showdown took place off the western coast of Sicily. The Roman commander, Gaius Lutatius Catullus, had spent the winter training his crews. Unlike previous fleets, these ships were built for speed and had the corvus removed to improve stability. The engagement. The Carthaginian fleet was heavily laden with supplies for Hamilcar's troops on Sicily. They were sluggish and undermanned. The tactics. Catullus took advantage of a favorable wind and intercepted the Carthaginians. Without their usual maneuvering advantage and weighed down by cargo, the Carthaginian ships were easy targets for the reinforced Roman rams. The collapse. 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk and 70 captured. Carthage, now unable to supply its forces in Sicily or fund a new fleet, sued for peace. The Treaty of Lutatius and the aftermath. The war ended with the Treaty of Lutatius. Carthage was forced to evacuate Sicily and the Lipari Islands. Carthage had to pay a massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. Both sides agreed to not attack each other's allies. Long-term consequences. Rome had emerged as the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, governed by a praetor. This marked the shift from Rome as an Italian power to Rome as an imperial power. However, the peace was bitter. Hamilcar Barca returned to Africa with a deep hatred for Rome, a hatred he would famously pass on to his son Hannibal. The First Punic War had settled the fate of Sicily, but it had only guaranteed that a second, even more destructive war would follow. The Second Punic War, the Shadow of Hannibal. 218 to 201 BCE. The peace following the First Punic War was little more than a 20-year breathing space. While Rome expanded into Cisalpine Gaul, the Po Valley, the Barcid family of Carthage carved out a new empire in Iberia, modern-day Spain. This new territory provided Carthage with silver mines to pay their debts and, more importantly, a limitless supply of hardened mercenary soldiers. The Spark, the Siege of Saguntum. In 219 BCE, Hannibal Barca, who had taken command of Carthaginian Spain at age 26, besieged Saguntum. Although Saguntum lay south of the Ebro River, the agreed-upon boundary of influence, it was a Roman ally. When the city fell after an 8-month siege, Rome declared war. Hannibal, however, did not wait for the Roman legions to arrive in Spain or Africa. He did the unthinkable. He marched his army over the Alps. The descent into Italy, 218 BCE. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps is one of the most celebrated feats in military history. He began with roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. By the time he descended into the Po Valley, half his men and most of his pack animals were dead from the cold, the terrain, and the attacks of mountain tribes. Despite these losses, his arrival paralyzed the Roman Senate. They had expected to fight in Spain and Africa. Instead, the war was on their doorstep. The Battle of the Trebia, December 218 BCE. The first major encounter took place near the Trebia River. The Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus was an impulsive commander, a trait Hannibal exploited. The bait. On a cold, snowy morning, Hannibal sent his Numidian light cavalry to harass the Roman camp. The Roman error. Sempronius, eager for glory, ordered his legions to cross the freezing, chest-deep waters of the Trebia before they had eaten breakfast. The ambush. As the shivering Romans struggled onto the opposite bank and engaged the Carthaginian line, Hannibal's brother, Mago, emerged from a hidden ravine with 2,000 elite troops slamming into the Roman rear. The result? The Roman army was shattered. Thousands drowned or were cut down. The Gauls of northern Italy, seeing Rome's weakness, deserted to Hannibal in droves. The Battle of Lake Trasimene, 14 BCE. The following year, the consul Gaius Flaminius attempted to intercept Hannibal as he moved south toward Rome. The setup: Hannibal positioned his army on the hills overlooking Lake Trasimene. A thick morning mist rolled off the water, obscuring the landscape. The trap: Flaminius, marching in a long, vulnerable column, pursued what he thought was the Carthaginian rearguard. He did not realize Hannibal's entire army was hidden in the tree line above him. The massacre. At a signal, the Carthaginians charged down the slopes. The Romans were trapped between the hills and the lake. There was no room to form lines. Flaminius was killed, and 15,000 Romans were either slaughtered or driven into the water to drown in their heavy armor. Cannae, the perfection of the double envelopment, 216 BCE. In response to these disasters, Rome raised its largest army to date, 8 legions, totaling nearly 80,000 men. Under the joint command of Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, they met Hannibal on the dusty plains of Cannae. The formations. The Romans. Varro packed his maniples deeply, creating a massive, dense block of infantry intended to punch through the Carthaginian center by sheer weight. Hannibal, he deployed his weakest troops, Gauls and Iberians, in a crescent shape bulging toward the Romans. His elite African heavy infantry stood on the flanks, and his superior cavalry was positioned on the wings. The steps of the battle. The retreat. As the Roman mass surged forward, the Carthaginian center slowly gave way, exactly as Hannibal had planned. The crescent shape bent inward, turning into a U shape. The trap closes. The Romans, thinking they were winning, pushed deeper into the U shape. This brought them exactly in line with the elite African infantry on the sides, who turned inward and attacked the Roman flanks. The cavalry stroke. Hannibal's heavy cavalry, having driven the Roman horse from the field, circled back and struck the Roman rear. The slaughter. The Romans were so tightly packed they couldn't even draw their swords. Over the next several hours, 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed, including Consul Paulus and 80 senators. It remains one of the deadliest single days of combat in human history. The Fabian strategy and the rise of Scipio. In the wake of Cannae, Rome seemed defeated. However, they refused to surrender. They adopted the Fabian strategy, named after Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, or the delayer, refusing to meet Hannibal in a pitched battle and instead wearing him down through scorched earth tactics and small skirmishes. Meanwhile, a young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later Africanus, took command in Spain. He realized that to defeat Hannibal, he must cut off his lifeblood, the silver and reinforcements from Iberia. The conquest of Spain. Scipio captured New Carthage in a daring amphibious assault and defeated Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago. The Metaurus, 207 BCE. Hasdrubal Barca managed to cross the Alps with a relief army, but was intercepted at the Metaurus River. He was killed, and his severed head was tossed into Hannibal's camp, the first Hannibal knew of his brother's arrival. The Battle of Zama, 202 BCE. Scipio eventually took the war to Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. The two greatest generals of the age finally met at Zama. The elephants. Hannibal opened with 80 elephants. Scipio countered by leaving vertical lanes in his infantry formations. The elephants charged through these alleys and were pelted with javelins from the sides, causing many to turn back into their own lines. The infantry grind. The veteran infantry of both sides fought to a standstill. The decisive blow. The Roman and Numidian cavalry, under the defector Massinissa, returned from chasing the Carthaginian horse and struck Hannibal's veterans from behind, using Hannibal's own tactic from Cannae against him. Aftermath. Carthage surrendered in 201 BCE. They were forced to surrender all but 10 warships, pay 10,000 talents over 50 years, forfeit all territory outside of Africa, and agree never to go to war without Roman permission. Rome was now the undisputed hegemon of the Western Mediterranean. The war had forged a new, more aggressive Roman identity. They had learned to fight on multiple fronts and sustain losses that would have destroyed any other state. Now, the stage was set for Rome to look east toward the Hellenistic kingdoms of Macedonia and the Seleucids. The Macedonian Wars and the subjugation of Greece, 200 to 146 BCE. With the defeat of Carthage, Rome was the undisputed master of the West. However, during the dark days after Cannae, Philip V of Macedon had entered into an alliance with Hannibal. Though Philip had provided little actual help to the Carthaginians, Rome had a long memory. The Senate viewed the Macedonian phalanx, the same engine of war used by Alexander the Great, as a looming threat to the stability of the Adriatic. The clash of systems, legion versus phalanx. The conflict between Rome and Macedonia was more than a struggle for territory. It was a trial between two diametrically opposed military philosophies. The Macedonian phalanx, a dense block of infantry, usually 16 ranks deep. Every man carried the sarissa, a pike of 18 to 21 feet. When leveled, the first 5 ranks of pikes projected beyond the front of the formation, creating an impenetrable force of iron. Its strength was its frontal invincibility. Its weakness was its total lack of maneuverability and its vulnerabilities on the flanks. The Roman Legion. As refined in the Punic Wars, the Legion was a chess piece. It was flexible, divided into maniples that could operate independently, and armed with the gladius for lethal close-quarters combat once the pike wall was breached. The Second Macedonian War and Cynocephalae, 197 BCE. After the inconclusive First Macedonian War, mostly a series of naval skirmishes, Rome sent the consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a man who combined Roman military grit with a deep appreciation for Greek culture. He met Philip V at a range of hills in Thessaly known as Cynocephalae, the Dog's Heads. The battle sequence. The fog of war. A heavy mist covered the hills, leading to a chance encounter between the scouting parties of both sides. As the skirmish grew, both commanders were forced to commit their full armies onto broken, hilly ground. The phalanx charge. Philip personally led his right wing, which was in its proper deep formation. They charged downhill, and the sheer weight of the pikes drove the Roman left wing back in disorder. The Roman counter. On the other side of the field, Flamininus noticed that Philip's left wing was still marching up the hill in a disorganized column. He launched his elephant and his right-wing infantry, shattering the unformed Macedonians. In the moment that perfectly illustrated the flexibility of the Roman system, an unnamed military tribune took 20 maniples, about 2,000 men, from the victorious Roman right and, without orders, turned them around to strike the rear of Philip's victorious right. The collapse. Trapped from behind and unable to turn their 20-foot pikes to face a rear assault, the Macedonian phalanx collapsed. Philip fled the field. At the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE, Flamininus declared the freedom of the Greeks. While the Greeks cheered, the reality was that they had merely traded a Macedonian master for a Roman protector. The War against Antiochus III, 192 to 188 BCE. The power vacuum left by Macedonia was quickly filled by the Seleucid Empire, led by Antiochus III the Great, who claimed the mantle of Alexander's successor in Asia. Encouraged by a refugeed Hannibal Barca, who was then serving as his advisor, Antiochus crossed into Greece. The Battle of Magnesia, 190 BCE. The decisive battle took place in modern-day Turkey. The Roman forces were led nominally by the consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio, but the true architect of the campaign was his brother, Scipio Africanus. The forces. Antiochus fielded a massive, diverse army of 70,000, including cataphracts, heavy armored cavalry, and scythed chariots. The Romans had 30,000. The tactical failure. Antiochus's scythed chariots panicked and turned back into his own camels and cavalry. The Roman legion's patience. The Roman legion stood firm against the Seleucid phalanx. When the Seleucid cavalry overextended itself in a pursuit, the Roman infantry exploited the gaps. The Seleucid army was annihilated, and the resulting Treaty of Apamea stripped Antiochus of his Mediterranean fleet and his lands in Asia Minor, effectively ending the Seleucid Empire as a major world power. The Third Macedonian War and Pydna, 168 BCE. Philip V's son Perseus sought to restore Macedonian prestige. This led to a final showdown at Pydna, where the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Polus faced the full might of the Macedonian pike wall. The initial terror. Polus later admitted that the sight of the leveled Macedonian pikes filled him with a terror and dread as such as he had never seen. The phalanx pushed the Romans back towards their camp. The rough ground. As the phalanx advanced, it moved over uneven terrain. Small gaps began to appear in the forest of pikes as the soldiers stepped over rocks and gullies. The insertion. Polus ordered his centurions to take their maniples and charge into these tiny fractures. Once inside the reach of the pikes, the Macedonians were defenseless. They dropped their sarissa and tried to fight with small daggers against Roman short swords and heavy shields. The result. In less than an hour, 20,000 Macedonians were dead. Perseus was captured and led through Rome in a triumph. The Macedonian monarchy was abolished. 146 BCE, the Year of Fire. The final subjugation of the East and the end of the Punic threat occurred simultaneously in 146 BCE. The Third Punic War. Driven by the obsession of Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with "Cato delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed, Rome picked a fight over a border dispute with Numidia. After a 3-year siege of horrific suffering, Scipio Aemilianus breached the walls. The city was leveled, the surviving 50,000 citizens were sold into slavery, and the legend, though likely apocryphal, says the soil was sown with salt. The Achaean War. In the same year, the Greek city of Corinth led a final desperate revolt against Roman dictates. The consul Lucius Mummius crushed the Achaean League and treated Corinth as Scipio treated Carthage. The city, the jewel of the Peloponnese, was plundered of its priceless art and burned to the ground. Consequences. By 146 BCE, Rome was no longer just a power, it was the hegemon. Wealth and corruption. The influx of Greek gold and slaves transformed Roman society, creating a massive gap between the wealthy elite and the displaced peasantry. Administrative shift. Rome now had to govern vast territories as provinces, leading to the rise of powerful, often corrupt military governors. The end of the balance. With no external rivals left, the Roman Republic began to turn its aggression inward. The era of the Great Foreign Wars was giving way to the era of civil strife.
The Numidian War and the reforms of Marius, 112 to 105 BCE. As the 2nd century BCE drew to a close, the Roman Republic faced a crisis that was as much moral and political as it was military. The conquest of the Mediterranean had brought unimaginable wealth to the senatorial class, but it had hollowed out the Roman middle class. The citizen farmers, who had been the backbone of the legions, were being replaced by massive slave-run estates, latifundia. This created a recruitment crisis. There were fewer men who met the property qualifications to serve in the army. This was the backdrop for the Jugurthine War, a conflict that exposed the deep-seated corruption within the Roman Senate and saw the rise of the man who would fundamentally reshape the Roman military, Gaius Marius. The rise of Jugurtha. Jugurtha was the illegitimate nephew of Micipsa, the king of Numidia, modern-day Algeria, and a loyal Roman ally. When Micipsa died, he left his kingdom to his 2 sons and Jugurtha. Jugurtha, a charismatic and ruthless warrior who had served alongside Roman forces in Spain, had no intention of sharing power. He murdered one cousin and drove the other, Adherbal, to seek Roman arbitration. Jugurtha knew the Roman Senate well. He famously remarked that Rome was a city for sale and doomed to perish as soon as it finds a purchaser. Through massive bribes, he initially secured a favorable partition of the kingdom. However, when he besieged Adherbal in the city of Cirta and executed Roman businessmen along with his cousin, the Roman public's outrage forced the Senate to declare war. A war of shadows and dust. The war in the North African desert was unlike the set-piece battles of Greece or Italy. The Numidians were masters of light cavalry tactics, utilizing hit-and-run maneuvers that frustrated the heavy Roman legions. The command of Metellus. Initially, the war was led by Quintus Caecilius Metellus, an aristocrat of impeccable integrity but cautious strategy. He managed to defeat Jugurtha at a formal engagement at the Battle of the Muthul, but he could not capture the elusive king. Jugurtha simply melted into the desert, returning to harass supply lines and poisoned wells. The rise of Gaius Marius. Marius was a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to achieve high office. He was a veteran soldier who ate with his troops and slept on the ground. Frustrated by Metellus' slow progress, Marius traveled to Rome, campaigned on a platform of military efficiency, and was elected consul in 107 BCE. The Marian Reforms. Before heading to Africa, Marius bypassed the Senate and implemented a series of radical changes that would end the militia era of Rome and begin the professional era. The proletarian recruitment. Marius abolished the property requirement. He opened the legions to the capite censi, the head count, the poorest citizens who owned nothing. These men no longer fought for their farms. They fought for their general, for a wage, and for the promise of land upon retirement. Marius's mules. To increase mobility, Marius required soldiers to carry all their own equipment, tents, tools, and rations on their backs. This eliminated the massive, slow-moving baggage trains that Jugurtha frequently raided. The cohort system. He reorganized the legion from 30 maniples into 10 cohorts. Each cohort, approximately 480 men, was a self-contained tactical unit, larger and more stable than a maniple, yet still flexible. The eagle,
also known as the Aquila. Marius gave each legion a single silver eagle as its sacred standard, fostering a deep sense of unit identity and esprit de corps. The end of the war, 106 to 105 BCE. Marius arrived in Africa with his new professionalized army. He conducted a brutal campaign of capturing Jugurtha's mountain strongholds one by one, depriving the king of his resources. However, the war was eventually ended through diplomacy and betrayal rather than a grand battle. Marius's young quaestor, a brilliant and ambitious aristocrat named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, negotiated with Jugurtha's father-in-law, King Bocchus of Mauritania. The capture. Sulla persuaded Bocchus to betray Jugurtha. During a meeting, Jugurtha was ambushed, bound, and handed over to Sulla. The aftermath. Jugurtha was brought to Rome in chains, paraded through the streets in Marius's triumph, and eventually starved to death in the Mamertine prison. Consequences. The Jugurthine War was the precursor to the Roman Revolution. Political rivalry. The credit for the victory was split. Marius had the triumph, but Sulla claimed the glory of the capture. This personal animosity would later explode into a devastating civil war. The professional soldier. The Roman army was now a professional force. While it made Rome invincible against foreign threats, it made the legions more loyal to their generals than to the state. As Marius celebrated his victory, a new and far more terrifying threat was descending from the north. Hundreds of thousands of Germanic tribesmen, the Cimbri and Teutons, had already annihilated several Roman armies. Rome's new professional legions were about to face their first true test of survival. The Cimbrian War, the Shield of Rome, 113 to 101 BCE. While Marius was finishing the war in Africa, the Republic was facing its most terrifying threat since Hannibal. For nearly a decade, two massive Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, had been wandering through Europe, seeking a new homeland. They were not a mere army, they were a nation on the move, including women, children, and thousands of heavy wagons. The Romans, accustomed to the disciplined Hellenistic phalanx or the light cavalry of Numidia, were shocked by the sheer size and ferocity of the Germanic warriors. These men were taller than the average Roman, fought with a wild, suicidal bravery, and utilized massive iron-headed clubs and long swords. The disaster at Arausio, 105 BCE. Before Marius could intervene, Rome suffered its greatest military defeat since Cannae. At Arausio, modern-day Orange, France, two Roman commanders, the aristocrat Scipio and the new man Malleus, refused to cooperate due to class friction. The engagement. The Cimbri and Teutones caught the two Roman armies divided by the Rhone River. The slaughter. Because the Roman camps were poorly coordinated, the Germanic tribes were able to annihilate them piece by piece. Historical sources claim 80,000 Roman soldiers and 40,000 camp followers were killed. The panic. Rome was left defenseless. The way to Italy was open. However, in a stroke of incredible luck, the Germanic tribes did not march on Rome immediately, but instead turned west toward Spain. Marius and the preparation. 104 to 102 BCE. The panic in Rome was so great that the law was set aside. Marius was elected consul in absentia and then re-elected for 5 consecutive years, an unprecedented and illegal move that highlighted the desperation of the state. Marius used this time to drill his new professional legions. He understood that the Roman soldier's greatest enemy was fear of the barbarian's physique. Hardening the troops, he kept the men occupied with massive engineering projects, such as digging the Fossa Mariana, a canal near the mouth of the Rhone, to ensure they were physically elite. Psychological warfare. He forced his men to watch the Germanic tribes from behind the safety of fortified walls, letting the soldiers grow accustomed to the enemy's strange appearance, war cries, and frantic dancing, until the novelty and the terror wore off. The Battle of Aquae Sextiae, 102 BCE. The Germanic coalition eventually split. The Teutones and Ambrones attempted to enter Italy via the Mediterranean coast, while the Cimbri moved through the Alpine passes. Marius moved to intercept the Teutones near Aquae Sextiae. The battle sequence. The Ambrones attack. The battle began prematurely when Roman camp followers, fetching water from a river, clashed with the Ambrones. The Romans won this initial skirmish, driving the Ambrones back to their wagon forts. The main engagement. 2 days later, the main body of the Teutones attacked the Roman uphill position. The hidden blow. Marius had hidden 3,000 elite troops under Marcus Claudius Marcellus in a nearby wooded ravine. The pincer. Just as the Teutones were exhausting themselves against the Roman shields, Marcellus's force emerged and struck the Germanic rear. The Teutones collapsed. Sources state that 100,000 tribesmen were killed or captured, and the local fields were so enriched by the blood and remains that they became legendary for their fertility for decades. The Battle of Vercellae, 101 BCE. The Cimbri, meanwhile, had successfully crossed the Alps and were occupying the Po Valley. They were even more numerous and better equipped than the Teutones. Marius joined his forces with proconsul Catulus to meet them on the Raudine Plain. The tactics. The dust and the sun. Marius positioned his army so the Cimbri had to charge with the morning sun in their eyes and the dust blowing into their faces. The cavalry clash. The Cimbrian cavalry, 15,000 strong and wearing helmets shaped like the heads of wild beasts, were surprised by the disciplined Roman cavalry and driven back into their own wagon forts. The infantry grind. The Roman legions, using their pila, javelins, to disable the heavy Cimbrian shields, moved in for the kill. The tragic end. As the Cimbrian men fell, the Roman legions reached the wagon forts. The Cimbrian women, seeing the battle lost, killed their children and then themselves to avoid the slavery that awaited them. Consequences and the new Roman reality. Marius was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. However, the Cimbrian War left a complex legacy: the veteran power. For the first time, Rome had a massive class of veteran soldiers who looked to their general, not the Senate, for their pension and land. The Germanic shadow. This was Rome's first major encounter with the North. The fear of Germanic migrations became a permanent fixture of the Roman psyche, a fear that would eventually be realized 4 centuries later. Political fragmentation. The cooperation between Marius and the aristocrat Catulus disintegrated into a bitter dispute over who deserved the credit for Vercellae, further fueling the fires of the coming civil wars. The Republic had been saved from the northern threat, but the internal foundations were cracking. Before the Romans could enjoy their peace, their own Italian allies, the very men who had fought alongside Marius, would rise up in a bloody rebellion for the right to be called Romans. The Social War, the Rebellion of the Allies, 91 through 88 BCE. For centuries, the expansion of Rome had been fueled by the blood and toil of the Socii, the Italian allies. These tribes, the Marsi, Samnites, Lucanians, and others, provided over half of the soldiers for the Roman legions, yet they were denied the fundamental rights of Roman citizenship. They paid taxes and fought Rome's wars, but they had no vote in the forum, no protection against the whims of Roman magistrates, and no share in the vast public lands they helped conquer. The Spark, the murder of Drusus. In 91 BCE, a reformist tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus attempted to grant citizenship to the Italians to stabilize the Republic. He was met with fierce aristocratic opposition and was eventually assassinated in his own home. For the Italians, this was the final proof that Rome would never grant them justice through the ballot. The result was a coordinated, massive secession that threatened the very existence of Rome. The Allies formed their own confederacy, called Italia. They established a capital at Corfinium, minted their own coins, one of which famously depicted an Italian bull goring a Roman wolf, and raised an army of 100,000 veterans, men who were trained in the exact same tactics as the Romans they were about to fight. The nature of the war. This was perhaps the most intimate and bitter conflict in Roman history. It was a social war, from socii, meaning allies, but it was effectively a civil war. Commanders on both sides had served together in the Cimbrian and Jugurthine Wars. They knew each other's faces, habits, and tactical preferences. The commanders. On Rome, the aging Gaius Marius, the ambitious Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and the consul Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, father of Pompey the Great. On Italia, the Marsic leader Quintus Popedius Silo and the Samnite Gaius Papius Mutilus. The two fronts. The war was fought on two main theaters, the northern front, led by the Marsi, and the southern front, led by the Samnites. The northern theater, 90 BCE. The Roman consul Publius Rutilius Lupus led an army against the Marsi. In a tragic display of Roman arrogance, Lupus ignored the advice of his legate Marius and marched into an ambush near the Liris River. Lupus was killed and the Roman line was shattered. It was only the arrival of Marius, who salvaged the situation with his typical tactical calm, that prevented a total rout. The southern theater. In the south, the Samnites, Rome's ancient enemies, were seeking more than just citizenship. They sought the destruction of Rome. They captured several Roman colonies and overran much of Campania. The Siege of Asculum, 89 BCE. The turning point in the north came at the city of Asculum. The consul Pompeius Strabo besieged the city with a massive force. This siege was a brutal affair of attrition, involving extensive tunneling and counter-tunneling. The lead slugs. Archaeologists have found thousands of lead sling bullets at the site, many inscribed with insults directed at the opposing commanders. The victory. Strabo eventually forced the city's surrender, executing the leaders of the rebellion. His victory restored Roman control over the central Adriatic coast. The rise of Sulla and the fall of the rebels. While Marius was slowed by age and a minor stroke, his former protege Sulla became the star of the southern front. The Battle of Nola. Sulla demonstrated his brilliance by outmaneuvering the Samnite forces, isolating their strongholds, and showing a ruthless streak that would later become his trademark. The capture of Bovianum. Sulla stormed the Samnite capital, effectively breaking the back of organized resistance in the south. The political solution. The Lex Julia. Rome realized that even if they won every battle, they could not win the war through force alone. The Italians were too numerous and too well trained. In 90 BCE, the consul Lucius Julius Caesar, an uncle of the famous Julius Caesar, passed the Lex Julia. This law offered Roman citizenship to any Italian community that had not yet revolted or would lay down their arms immediately. Later laws extended this to almost all Italians south of the Po River. The end of the war. The offer of citizenship effectively broke the rebellion. Most allies, having achieved their primary goal, returned to the Roman fold. Only the Samnites and the Lucanians held out, turning the conflict into a bitter guerrilla war that eventually merged into Rome's first great civil war. Long-term consequences. The social war fundamentally changed the Roman state. Total unification. For the first time, Italy and Rome became synonymous. The peninsula was now a single political entity with a unified citizen body. The death of the city-state. Rome was no longer a city-state ruling an empire. It was a nation-state. However, its political institutions, designed for a small city, were now hopelessly inadequate for governing millions of citizens spread across Italy. Sulla versus Marius. The social war solidified Sulla's reputation as Rome's premier general, eclipsing the aging Marius. This rivalry was now ready to explode as the Senate prepared to appoint a commander for a new war in the east against Mithridates of Pontus. The social war proved that Rome could survive an internal collapse, but the price of victory was the empowerment of individual generals who now held the keys to the Republic's survival.
The Mithridatic Wars, the Poison King of the East, 88 to 63 BCE. As Rome was emerging from the bloodbath of the social war, a new and sophisticated threat appeared in the east. Mithridates VI of Pontus, known as the Poison King due to his lifelong habit of ingesting small doses of toxins to build immunity, sought to build a new Persian-style empire in Asia Minor. He was a polyglot, a brilliant strategist, and a man of immense cruelty who presented himself as a liberator to the Greeks, promising to free them from the shackles of Roman taxation and administration. The Asiatic Vespers, 88 BCE. The war began with an act of calculated genocide. Mithridates issued a secret order to all the cities of Asia Minor. On a single day, every Roman and Italian citizen, man, woman, and child, was to be slaughtered. History records that 80,000 people were murdered in a coordinated massacre known as the Asiatic Vespers. Mithridates then crossed into Greece, invited by the Athenians, who saw him as a new Alexander. Sulla and the Siege of Athens, 87 to 86 BCE. The Roman response was delayed by the civil strife between Marius and Sulla. Eventually, Lucius Cornelius Sulla landed in Greece with 5 legions. He lacked a fleet and money, so he famously plundered the sacred treasures of Delphi and Olympia to fund his campaign. Sulla laid siege to Athens and its port, Piraeus. The siege was a marvel of ancient engineering. The earthworks. Sulla built massive mounds of earth and timber to overlook the city walls. The famine. He cut off all supplies, reducing the Athenians to eating shoes and boiled leather. The breach. On the night of March 1st, 86 BCE, Sulla's engineers identified a weak point in the wall. The Romans swarmed in, and Sulla, enraged by the insults the Athenians had shouted from the walls, allowed a brutal sack of the city. The Battle of Chaeronea, 86 BCE. Shortly after the fall of Athens, Sulla faced the main Pontic army under the general Archelaus. The Pontic forces outnumbered the Romans 3-1 and utilized terrifying scythed chariots. The battle sequence. The trenches. To neutralize the scythed chariots, Sulla dug a series of deep trenches along his front. The chariot charge. Archelaus launched his chariots. Unable to gain speed because of the trenches and the narrowness of the valley, the chariots were easily disabled by Roman javelins. Many turned back into their own lines, causing chaos. The phalanx clash. The Pontic phalanx, composed partly of freed slaves, initially held firm. However, Sulla used his reserve cohorts to plug gaps and eventually envelop the Pontic wings. The rout. Archelaus's army collapsed. Of the 120,000 Pontic troops, only 10,000 were said to have escaped. The rise of Pompey the Great. While Sulla returned to Rome to establish his dictatorship, Mithridates remained a persistent threat. The task of finally ending the Eastern question eventually fell to Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey, who was granted unprecedented extraordinary powers, Imperium Maius, over the entire Mediterranean. The campaign of 66 BCE. Pompey was a master of logistics. He cornered Mithridates near the Euphrates River at the Battle of the Lycus. The night attack. Pompey launched a surprise night assault. The moon was low behind the Romans, casting long shadows toward the Pontic lines. The Pontic soldiers, misjudging the distance due to the shadows, threw their javelins too early, hitting nothing. The Romans then charged home. The end of the king. Mithridates fled to the Crimean Peninsula. Hemmed in by his own son's rebellion and realizing his immunity to poison made suicide by draft impossible, he was forced to ask a Gallic bodyguard to kill him with a sword in 63 BCE. Consequences and the New East. Pompey did not just win a war, he reorganized the world. New provinces. He annexed Syria and Judea, turning the Levant into a Roman buffer zone. This was the moment Rome truly became a Middle Eastern power. The wealth of the East. The plunder and taxes from Pompey's conquests doubled the annual revenue of the Roman treasury. The triumvirate. Pompey's return to Rome as the wealthiest and most powerful man in the Republic would lead directly to the political alliance with Julius Caesar and Crassus, known as the First Triumvirate. The Mithridatic Wars showed that Rome could now project power thousands of miles from the Tiber. But while Pompey was settling the east, his young rival Julius Caesar was looking toward the dark forests of the north, seeking a conquest that would eclipse even the glory of the Poison King.
The Gallic Wars, the ascent of Julius Caesar, 58 to 50 BCE. By 58 BCE, the Roman Republic was dominated by three men: Pompey the Great, Marcus Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. To match the military prestige of Pompey and the immense wealth of Crassus, Caesar required a massive independent command. He secured the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul, southern France. The Gallic Wars were not a single conflict, but a decade-long series of campaigns intended to bring the vast, tribal territories of modern-day France, Belgium, and Switzerland under Roman heel. This war would transform Caesar into a billionaire and the leader of a battle-hardened army loyal only to him. The Helvetii and the Migration Crisis, 58 BCE. The war began under the guise of border security. The Helvetii, a confederation of tribes from modern Switzerland, decided to migrate en masse to western Gaul to escape Germanic pressure. Caesar, arguing that this migration would destabilize the Roman province, refused them passage. The Battle of Bibracte. After a grueling pursuit, Caesar forced the Helvetii into a pitched battle. The Helvetii utilized a traditional phalanx-like shield wall. Caesar famously ordered his officers to dismount, including himself, to show that the danger was shared and to remove any temptation to flee. The pila, the Roman heavy javelins, pila, were crucial here. When thrown into the Helvetian shield wall, the soft iron necks of the spears bent, making them impossible to pull out. The Helvetii were forced to discard their heavy, pinned shields and fight unprotected. They were slaughtered, and their survivors were forced back to their Alpine homes. The Belgae and the Nerve of the Legions, 57 BCE. Caesar then moved against the Belgae, a fierce northern coalition. The most dangerous moment came at the Battle of the Sabis against the Nervi. The ambush. While the Romans were busy fortifying their camp, the Nervi launched a lightning-fast assault from the woods. The chaos. The Roman lines were not yet formed. Centurions fell, and the 12th Legion was nearly surrounded. Caesar himself had to grab a shield from a soldier and run to the front line to inspire his men. The turning point. The arrival of the Roman rearguard and the 10th Legion, Caesar's favorite, saved the day. The Nervi refused to flee, fighting atop the bodies of their fallen comrades until they were virtually annihilated. The Great Revolt and Vercingetorix, 52 BCE. For years, Caesar played the Gallic tribes against one another. However, in 52 BCE, a young Arvernian nobleman named Vercingetorix achieved the impossible. He united the disparate Gallic tribes in a national war of independence. He used scorched earth tactics, burning towns and crops to starve the Roman legions. The Siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix eventually retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia. Caesar, realizing an assault on the cliffs was suicidal, ordered his men to build a circumvallation, an 11-mile ring of fortifications around the city to starve the Gauls. The Double Wall. Learning that a massive Gallic relief army of 250,000 was coming to rescue Vercingetorix, Caesar ordered a second wall, the contravallation, built facing outward. The Romans were now inside a fortified donut, besieged from the outside while besieging the inside. The final clash. The relief army and Vercingetorix's forces attacked simultaneously. The Roman lines nearly broke at a weak point in the northern hill. Caesar, wearing his signature scarlet cloak so his men could see him, led the final reserve of cavalry himself to strike the relief army's flank. The surrender. The relief army scattered. The next day, Vercingetorix rode out of the gates in his finest armor, circled Caesar's seat, and threw his weapons at the Romans' feet. Consequences. The Rubicon and the end of the Republic. The conquest of Gaul was complete. It is estimated that 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved. The new frontier. The Rhine River became the permanent border between the Roman world and the Germanic tribes. The military power. Now, Caesar possessed an army that had fought together for 10 years. They were more loyal to Caesar than to the Republic. The Civil War. When the Senate, led by a jealous Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome to face trial for legal irregularities, Caesar chose a different path. In January of 49 BCE, he led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the sacred boundary of Italy. He reportedly said, "Alia iacta est," or "the die is cast." The Gallic Wars had ended, but the Roman Civil War, a war that would finally destroy the Republic and give birth to the Empire, had begun. The Great Civil War, Caesar versus Pompey, 49 to 45 BCE. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not just initiate a rebellion, he ignited a global conflict that spanned the entirety of the Roman world, from the Pillars of Hercules to the deserts of Egypt. The war was a clash between two titans, Caesar, the master of speed and aggression, and Pompey the Great, the legendary administrator and teenage butcher who represented the traditional authority of the Senate. The flight of the Senate. Caesar's lightning-fast descent into Italy caught Pompey off guard. Lacking the immediate troops to defend Rome, Pompey and the majority of the Senate fled across the Adriatic to Greece, intending to leverage the vast resources of the East to build an unstoppable army. Caesar, rather than pursuing immediately without a fleet, turned west to Spain to neutralize the army without a leader before facing the leader without an army. In a brilliant 40-day campaign at Ilerda, he forced Pompey's veteran Spanish legions to surrender through maneuver and starvation rather than bloodshed. The Siege of Dyrrhachium, 48 BCE. In early 48 BCE, Caesar risked the winter crossing of the Adriatic with a fraction of his forces, successfully landing in modern-day Albania. He attempted to blockade Pompey's much larger army at Dyrrhachium by building a massive 15-mile line of fortifications. The failure of the blockade. Pompey, utilizing his superior naval power, identified a gap in the southern end of Caesar's wall. He landed troops by sea and struck the Roman flank. The rare defeat. Caesar's men panicked and fled. Had Pompey pursued aggressively, the war might have ended that day. Caesar later remarked, "Today the enemy would have won if they had a commander who was a winner." The Battle of Pharsalus, August 48 BCE. Caesar retreated into the plains of Thessaly to feed his hungry troops. Pompey, pressured by the arrogant senators in his camp who were already debating who would take Caesar's villas, finally gave battle near the Enipeus River. The forces. Pompey had 45,000 infantry and 7,000 elite cavalry. Caesar had 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The masterstroke. Pompey's plan was simple. use his overwhelming cavalry to smash Caesar's small horse contingent, wheel around, and strike the veteran legions from the rear. Caesar anticipated this. He hid a fourth line of 6 elite cohorts behind his cavalry, instructing them not to throw their pila, but to use them as pikes, aiming for the faces of the young aristocratic Pompeian horsemen. The cavalry charge. Pompey's cavalry swept aside Caesar's horse, the hidden trap. As the Pompeian cavalry surged forward in disorder, the hidden fourth line rose and jabbed their spears into the riders. The pretty boys of the Roman nobility panicked and fled the field. The envelopment. Caesar's fourth line then moved around the exposed Pompeian flank. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered his third line, his veterans, to charge. The result, the Pompeian army collapsed. Pompey fled his camp, which was already decorated for a victory feast, and escaped to Egypt. The Alexandrian War and the death of Pompey. When Pompey stepped onto the shores of Egypt,
The birth of the empire, 32 to 30 BCE. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not restore the Republic. It created a power vacuum that plunged the Mediterranean into 13 more years of chaos. Out of the bloodbath of the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance between Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's young heir, and Lepidus, a final binary struggle emerged. It was a clash between the Roman West, led by the calculating Octavian, and the Hellenistic East, led by Antony and the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII. The Propaganda War. Before a single sword was drawn, Octavian waged the masterful campaign of character assassination. He portrayed Mark Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man bewitched by an Oriental queen, claiming he had abandoned Roman virtues for the decadence of Alexandria. When Octavian illegally seized and read Antony's will in the Senate, which allegedly bequeathed Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children, and asked for Antony to be buried in Egypt, the public outrage allowed Octavian to declare war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The campaign at Actium, September 2, 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra moved their massive force to the west coast of Greece, establishing a base at Actium. They possessed a formidable fleet of roughly 500 ships and a massive land army of 100,000 infantry. Octavian, however, had a secret weapon, his lifelong friend and brilliant naval strategist Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The blockade. Agrippa conducted a series of daring naval raids, capturing key supply ports and effectively blockading Antony's fleet inside the Ambracian Gulf. Throughout the summer of 31 BCE, Antony's army was ravaged by malaria and hunger. Desperate to break out before his forces evaporated through desertion, Antony decided to seek a naval confrontation. The Battle of Actium, September 2, 31 BCE. The two fleets met just outside the Straits of Actium. The technical contrast between the two navies was stark. Antony's fleet. Primarily massive quinqueremes and even larger tens. These were floating fortresses, heavily armored with timber to prevent ramming and equipped with towers for archers and catapults. Octavian's fleet. Led by Agrippa, the Romans used smaller, highly maneuverable vessels called Liburnians. While they couldn't ram the heavy hulls of Antony's ships, they could swarm them like hornets. The engagement. The stalemate. For several hours, the battle was a chaotic melee. The Roman Liburnians circled the giant Egyptian ships, snapping their oars and showering them with fire darts and stones. Antony's ships, in turn, used grappling hooks to try and pull the smaller vessels close for boarding. The gap. A gap opened in the center of the Roman line. To the shock of both sides, Cleopatra, who had been waiting in the rear with 60 of her swiftest galleys, suddenly hoisted sail and fled toward Egypt. Antony's choice. Seeing Cleopatra depart, Antony abandoned his men. He transferred to a smaller boat and followed her, leaving his fleet and his land army leaderless. The remaining fleet fought on bravely until late afternoon, but without their commander, they eventually surrendered or were burned. The land army, finding themselves abandoned by the man they had followed for years, defected to Octavian a week later. The Fall of Alexandria, 30 BCE. Octavian followed the pair to Egypt. After a final, brief skirmish outside the walls of Alexandria, Antony received the false report that Cleopatra was dead. He attempted suicide by falling on his sword, eventually dying in the arms of the queen, who had fled to her reinforced mausoleum. Octavian entered Alexandria as a conqueror. Cleopatra, realizing she would be paraded through the streets of Rome in a humiliating triumph, committed suicide, traditionally by the bite of an asp. Octavian annexed Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the world, as his personal province. Consequences: the Pax Romana. The victory at Actium marked the true end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Principate. Augustus, in 27 BCE, took the name Augustus. He maintained the facade of the Republic while holding all real power as the princeps, first citizen. A professional army. Augustus finalized the military reforms started by Marius. He created a standing army with fixed terms of service and established the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor. The Golden Age. The civil wars that had plagued Rome for a century were over. Augustus ushered in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability that would last for 2 centuries. Rome was no longer a city-state struggling for survival. It was a global empire. But as Augustus turned his gaze towards the borders, he realized that the greatest threat to this new peace lay across the Rhine, in the dark, trackless forests of Germania.
The Great Civil War, Caesar versus Pompey, 49 to 45 BCE. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not just initiate a rebellion, he ignited a global conflict that spanned the entirety of the Roman world, from the Pillars of Hercules to the deserts of Egypt. The war was a clash between 2 titans, Caesar, the master of speed and aggression, and Pompey the Great, the legendary administrator and teenage butcher who represented the traditional authority of the Senate. The flight of the Senate. Caesar's lightning-fast descent into Italy caught Pompey off guard. Lacking the immediate troops to defend Rome, Pompey and the majority of the Senate fled across the Adriatic to Greece, intending to leverage the vast resources of the East to build an unstoppable army. Caesar, rather than pursuing immediately without a fleet, turned west to Spain to neutralize the army without a leader before facing the leader without an army. In a brilliant 40-day campaign at Ilerda, he forced Pompey's veteran Spanish legions to surrender through maneuver and starvation rather than bloodshed. The Siege of Dyrrhachium, 48 BCE. In early 48 BCE, Caesar risked the winter crossing of the Adriatic with a fraction of his forces, successfully landing in modern-day Albania. He attempted to blockade Pompey's much larger army at Dyrrhachium by building a massive 15-mile line of fortifications. The failure of the blockade. Pompey, utilizing his superior naval power, identified a gap in the southern end of Caesar's wall. He landed troops by sea and struck the Roman flank. The rare defeat. Caesar's men panicked and fled. Had Pompey pursued aggressively, the war might have ended that day. Caesar later remarked, "Today the enemy would have won if they had a commander who was a winner." The Battle of Pharsalus, August 48 BCE. Caesar retreated into the plains of Thessaly to feed his hungry troops. Pompey, pressured by the arrogant senators in his camp who were already debating who would take Caesar's villas, finally gave battle near the Enipeus River. The forces. Pompey had 45,000 infantry and 7,000 elite cavalry. Caesar had 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The masterstroke. Pompey's plan was simple. Use his overwhelming cavalry to smash Caesar's small horse contingent, wheel around, and strike the veteran legions from the rear. Caesar anticipated this. He hid a 4th line of 6 elite cohorts behind his cavalry, instructing them not to throw their pila, but to use them as pikes, aiming for the faces of the young aristocratic Pompeian horsemen. The cavalry charge.
Pompey's cavalry swept aside Caesar's horse, the hidden trap. As the Pompeian cavalry surged forward in disorder, the hidden fourth line rose and jabbed their spears into the riders. The pretty boys of the Roman nobility panicked and fled the field. The envelopment. Caesar's fourth line then moved around the exposed Pompeian flank. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered his third line, his veterans, to charge. The result, the Pompeian army collapsed. Pompey fled his camp, which was already decorated for a victory feast, and escaped to Egypt. The Alexandrian War and the death of Pompey. When Pompey stepped onto the shores of Egypt, he was murdered by the advisors of the boy king Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to win Caesar's favor. Instead, when Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head, he wept. Caesar became embroiled in a dynastic struggle between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra VII, the siege of Alexandria. Trapped in the royal quarter with only 4,000 men, Caesar fought a desperate urban war. During the fighting, the great library of Alexandria was partially burned. The Nile. After reinforcements arrived, Caesar defeated the Ptolemaic army at the Battle of the Nile. He placed Cleopatra on the throne, securing Egypt's grain for Rome. The final pockets, Thapsus and Munda. The war dragged on as the Optimate, senatorial cause rallied in Africa and Spain. The Battle of Thapsus, 46 BCE. In North Africa, Caesar faced the combined forces of Metellus Scipio and King Juba of Numidia. Caesar's veterans, enraged by the length of the war, ignored their officers' calls for mercy and slaughtered 10,000 of the enemy. The great Stoic Cato the Younger committed suicide rather than live in a world ruled by Caesar. The Battle of Munda, 45 BCE. The final battle took place in Spain against Pompey's sons. It was the most desperate fight of Caesar's career. At one point, Caesar's veterans began to give way. He reportedly grabbed the shield and ran toward the enemy, shouting, "Are you going to betray your general?" His men rallied, and the Pompeian cause was finally extinguished. The consequences, the dictatorship. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the world. He was named Dictator Perpetua, dictator for life. Reforms. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, settled his veterans on land, and granted citizenship to more provincials. The end of the Republic. By centralizing all power in his person, Caesar effectively ended the 500-year-old republic. However, Caesar's clemency, his policy of forgiving his enemies, proved his undoing. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, a group of conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinated him in the Senate, believing they were restoring liberty. Instead, they triggered a final cycle of civil wars that would lead to the rise of Rome's first emperor, Augustus.
The War of Actium, the birth of the empire, 32 to 30 BCE. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not restore the Republic. It created a power vacuum that plunged the Mediterranean into 13 more years of chaos. Out of the bloodbath of the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance between Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's young heir, and Lepidus, a final binary struggle emerged. It was a clash between the Roman West, led by the calculating Octavian, and the Hellenistic East, led by Antony and the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII. The Propaganda War. Before a single sword was drawn, Octavian waged the masterful campaign of character assassination. He portrayed Mark Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man bewitched by an Oriental queen, claiming he had abandoned Roman virtues for the decadence of Alexandria. When Octavian illegally seized and read Antony's will in the Senate, which allegedly bequeathed Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children, and asked for Antony to be buried in Egypt, the public outrage allowed Octavian to declare war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The Campaign at Actium, September 2, 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra moved their massive force to the west coast of Greece, establishing a base at Actium. They possessed a formidable fleet of roughly 500 ships and a massive land army of 100,000 infantry. Octavian, however, had a secret weapon, his lifelong friend and brilliant naval strategist Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The blockade. Agrippa conducted a series of daring naval raids, capturing key supply ports and effectively blockading Antony's fleet inside the Ambracian Gulf. Throughout the summer of 31 BCE, Antony's army was ravaged by malaria and hunger. Desperate to break out before his forces evaporated through desertion, Antony decided to seek a naval confrontation. The Battle of Actium, September 2, 31 BCE. The two fleets met just outside the Straits of Actium. The technical contrast between the two navies was stark. Antony's fleet. Primarily massive quinqueremes and even larger tens. These were floating fortresses, heavily armored with timber to prevent ramming and equipped with towers for archers and catapults. Octavian's fleet. Led by Agrippa, the Romans used smaller, highly maneuverable vessels called Liburnians. While they couldn't ram the heavy hulls of Antony's ships, they could swarm them like hornets. The engagement. The stalemate. For several hours, the battle was a chaotic melee. The Roman Liburnians circled the giant Egyptian ships, snapping their oars and showering them with fire darts and stones. Antony's ships, in turn, used grappling hooks to try and pull the smaller vessels close for boarding. The gap. A gap opened in the center of the Roman line. To the shock of both sides, Cleopatra, who had been waiting in the rear with 60 of her swiftest galleys, suddenly hoisted sail and fled toward Egypt. Antony's choice. Seeing Cleopatra depart, Antony abandoned his men. He transferred to a smaller boat and followed her, leaving his fleet and his land army leaderless. The remaining fleet fought on bravely until late afternoon, but without their commander, they eventually surrendered or were burned. The land army, finding themselves abandoned by the man they had followed for years, defected to Octavian a week later. The Fall of Alexandria, 30 BCE. Octavian followed the pair to Egypt. After a final, brief skirmish outside the walls of Alexandria, Antony received the false report that Cleopatra was dead. He attempted suicide by falling on his sword, eventually dying in the arms of the queen, who had fled to her reinforced mausoleum. Octavian entered Alexandria as a conqueror. Cleopatra, realizing she would be paraded through the streets of Rome in a humiliating triumph, committed suicide, traditionally by the bite of an asp. Octavian annexed Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the world, as his personal province. Consequences. The Pax Romana. The victory at Actium marked the true end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Principate. Augustus, in 27 BCE, took the name Augustus. He maintained the facade of the Republic while holding all real power as the princeps, first citizen. A professional army. Augustus finalized the military reforms started by Marius. He created a standing army with fixed terms of service and established the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor. The Golden Age. The civil wars that had plagued Rome for a century were over. Augustus ushered in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability that would last for 2 centuries. Rome was no longer a city-state struggling for survival. It was a global empire. But as Augustus turned his gaze towards the borders, he realized that the greatest threat to this new peace lay across the Rhine, in the dark, trackless forests of Germania. The Teutoburg Forest, the limits of empire, 9 CE. Under the reign of Augustus, the Roman Empire reached the level of unprecedented power. The frontiers were being pushed to the great rivers, the Danube and the Rhine. Augustus's stepsons, Drusus and Tiberius, had spent years campaigning in the interior of Germania, attempting to turn the vast territory between the Rhine and the Elbe into a formal Roman province. By 6 CE, the mission seemed nearly complete. However, the Romans made a fatal error. They underestimated the depth of Germanic resentment toward Roman taxation and legal imposition. The protagonists. Publius Quintilius Verus. The man chosen to govern Germania was not a soldier's general like Drusus, but a lawyer and administrator.
Having previously served as governor of Syria, Varus was accustomed to the settled, submissive populations of the East. He treated the fierce tribal Germans as if they were already a conquered, tax-paying people, ignoring the cultural tinderbox he was entering. Arminius. Opposing him was a young chieftain of the Cherusci tribe named Arminius. He was a Roman citizen, an equestrian, and a commander of Germanic auxiliary troops. He had lived in Rome, spoke fluent Latin, and understood the Roman military mind from the inside. To Varus, Arminius was a loyal ally. To the Germanic tribes, he was a secret revolutionary. The trap is set. In the autumn of 9 CE, Varus was preparing to move his 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, from their summer camps on the Weser River back to winter quarters on the Rhine. Approximately 20,000 soldiers and 10,000 camp followers, women, children, and servants, marched in a column that stretched for miles. Arminius fabricated reports of a local uprising deep in the forest to lure Varus off the main Roman road and into the trackless wilderness of the Teutoburg forest. Despite warnings from another Germanic noble, Segestes, that Arminius was plotting a betrayal, Varus dismissed the claims as a personal feud and marched into the trees. The Massacre, September 9 CE. The battle was not a single event, but a running slaughter that lasted 4 days and nights. Day 1. The Storm. As the Romans entered a dense, swampy forest, a violent autumnal storm broke. The ground became a quagmire. The heavy Roman baggage wagons bogged down, and the long column became dangerously extended. Suddenly, the Germanic tribesmen began showering the column with javelins from the safety of the thick undergrowth. The Roman response. Varus attempted to build a fortified camp, but the terrain prevented a proper square formation. Morale began to plummet as the legionaries realized their superior heavy equipment was a liability in the mud and close-quarters brush. The narrow pass. On the final day, the remnants of the army reached a narrow strip of dry land between a wooded hill, the Caukries, and a great bog. Arminius had prepared a massive earthen wall, several hundred yards long, hidden in the trees. The final collapse. As the Romans tried to push through the narrow gap, the Germans charged from behind the wall. The Roman cavalry attempted to flee, but were cut down. Seeing all was lost, Varus and his senior officers committed suicide by falling on their swords to avoid the horrific torture that awaited Roman captives. The aftermath. Of the 30,000 people who marched with Varus, only a handful of survivors reached the Rhine. The 3 legionary eagles were captured. When the news reached Rome, Augustus was reportedly so distraught that he let his hair and beard grow long, frequently hitting his head against the palace walls and crying out, "Quintili vere, legiones rede." Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. Long-term consequences. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest changed the course of European history. The Rhine border. Augustus abandoned the plan to annex Germania. The Rhine became the permanent, psychological, and cultural border between the Latin-speaking Roman world and the Germanic-speaking North. The Lost Legions. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used again in the Roman army. They were considered cursed. Germanic identity. Arminius, later celebrated as Hermann in German lore, became a symbol of resistance. Though he was eventually assassinated by his own relatives, his victory ensured that Northern Europe would remain outside the Roman orbit. The Roman Empire had found its limit. For the next 100 years, the emperors would focus on consolidating their borders and looking towards a new island across the sea, Britain. The conquest of Britain, the edge of the world, 43 to 84 CE. For nearly a century after Julius Caesar's brief expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE, Britain remained a land of myth to the Roman mind, a mysterious, fog-shrouded island beyond the ocean that circled the known world. While trade persisted, No Roman soldiers set foot on the island until the Emperor Claudius, seeking military prestige to solidify his shaky hold on the throne, ordered a full-scale invasion in 43 CE. The invasion and the Battle of the Medway. Claudius dispatched 4 legions, 2 Augusta, 9 Hispana, 14 Gemina, and 20 Valevia Victrix, totaling roughly 40,000 men including auxiliaries, under the command of Aulus Plautius. The British tribes, led by the brothers Caradicus and Togodumnus of the Catavallani, did not meet the Romans on the beaches, but waited until they reached the river Medway. The river crossing. The British believed the river was an impassable barrier. However, Plautius deployed his Batavian auxiliaries, Germanic troops trained to swim across rivers in full armor. They crossed silently, targeting the Britons' chariot horses and causing chaos in the rear. The 2-day struggle. Unlike most ancient battles, which were decided in hours, the Medway lasted 2 days. Vespasian, the future emperor, led a daring flanking maneuver that finally broke the British line. The fall of Camulodunum. Claudius himself arrived shortly after with reinforcements, including war elephants, to witness the surrender of the tribal capital at Camulodunum, modern Colchester. The Revolt of Boudica, 60 to 61 CE. The most significant challenge to Roman rule came nearly 20 years later. When Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, died, he left his kingdom to his daughters and the Roman emperor jointly. The Romans ignored the will, flogged his widow Boudica, and raped his daughters. Boudica rose in a fury, unifying the Iceni and Trinovantes, while the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was busy campaigning against the Druids on the island of Mona, Anglesey. Boudica's host incinerated the 3 largest Roman towns, Camulodunum, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. Archaeologists still find a distinct red layer of burnt debris from this event. The Battle of Watling Street. Suetonius Paulinus gathered roughly 10,000 men to face a rebel force estimated at over 100,000. The terrain. Suetonius chose a narrow defile with a forest at his back. This neutralized the Britons' superior numbers, as they could only attack in a narrow front. The wagon trap. The Britons were so confident of victory, they brought their families to watch, parking their wagons in a massive crescent behind their lines, effectively blocking their own retreat. The wedge. The Romans threw their javelins and then charged in a wedge formation. The disciplined legionaries pushed into the disorganized mass. When the Britons tried to flee, they were caught against their own wagons. The massacre was total. Boudica later committed suicide by poison. The campaigns of Agricola and the Battle of Mons Gropius, 83-84 CE. The final push to conquer the whole island was led by Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose exploits were recorded by his son-in-law, the historian Tacitus. Agricola pushed deep into the Scottish Highlands, Caledonia, to face the Caledoni under their leader Calgagus. The engagement. The auxiliary front. In a rare move, Agricola placed his 8,000 auxiliaries in the front line, keeping his Roman legions in reserve behind the fortifications. The Highland Charge. The Caledonians held the higher ground. They used long, blunt-ended swords and small shields, which proved ineffective against the stabbing tactics of the Batavian and Tundrian auxiliaries in close quarters. The cavalry envelopment. As the Caledonians tried to bypass the auxiliary line to strike the Roman flanks, Agricola unleashed 4 squadrons of cavalry that had been kept in reserve. They rode around the main body and struck the Caledonians from the rear. Consequences. While Agricola won the battle, the conquest of Scotland was never fully realized. The withdrawal. Domitian, the emperor at the time, recalled Agricola to Rome and withdrew troops to the Danube frontier, leaving the north of Britain unconquered. Hadrian's Wall. Decades later, the Emperor Hadrian would formalize this limit by building his famous 73-mile wall, marking the final northern boundary of the Roman world. Britain would remain a Roman province for over 300 years, but it would always be a frontier land, requiring a massive military presence to hold the line against the unconquered tribes of the north. The conquest of Britain, the edge of the world. 43 to 84 CE. For nearly a century after Julius Caesar's brief expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE, Britain remained a land of myth to the Roman mind, a mysterious, fog-shrouded island beyond the ocean that circled the known world. While trade persisted, no Roman soldiers set foot on the island until the Emperor Claudius, seeking military prestige to solidify his shaky hold on the throne, ordered a full-scale invasion in 43 CE. The invasion and the Battle of the Medway. Claudius dispatched 4 legions, 2 Augusta, 9 Hispana, 14 Gemina, and 20 Valevia Victrix, totaling roughly 40,000 men including auxiliaries, under the command of Aulus Plautius. The British tribes, led by the brothers Caradicus and Togodumnus of the Cativalani, did not meet the Romans on the beaches, but waited until they reached the River Medway. The river crossing. The British believed the river was an impassable barrier. However, Plautius deployed his Batavian auxiliaries, Germanic troops trained to swim across rivers in full armor. They crossed silently, targeting the Britons' chariot horses and causing chaos in the rear. The 2-day struggle. Unlike most ancient battles which were decided in hours, the Medway lasted 2 days. Vespasian, the future emperor, led a daring flanking maneuver that finally broke the British line. The fall of Camulodunum. Claudius himself arrived shortly after with reinforcements, including war elephants, to witness the surrender of the tribal capital at Camulodunum, modern Colchester. The Revolt of Boudica, 60 to 61 CE. The most significant challenge to Roman rule came nearly 20 years later. When Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, died, he left his kingdom to his daughters and the Roman emperor jointly. The Romans ignored the will, flogged his widow Boudica, and raped his daughters. Boudica rose in a fury, unifying the Iceni and Trinovantes, while the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was busy campaigning against the Druids on the island of Mona, Anglesey. Boudica's host incinerated the 3 largest Roman towns, Camulodunum, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. Archaeologists still find a distinct red layer of burnt debris from this event. The Battle of Watling Street. Suetonius Paulinus gathered roughly 10,000 men to face a rebel force estimated at over 100,000. The terrain. Suetonius chose a narrow defile with a forest at his back. This neutralized the Britons' superior numbers, as they could only attack in a narrow front. The wagon trap. The Britons were so confident of victory, they brought their families to watch, parking their wagons in a massive crescent behind their lines, effectively blocking their own retreat. The wedge. The Romans threw their javelins and then charged in a wedge formation. The disciplined legionaries pushed into the disorganized mass. When the Britons tried to flee, they were caught against their own wagons. The massacre was total. Boudica later committed suicide by poison. The campaigns of Agricola and the Battle of Mons Gropius, 83-84 CE. The final push to conquer the whole island was led by Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose exploits were recorded by his son-in-law, the historian Tacitus. Agricola pushed deep into the Scottish Highlands, Caledonia, to face the Caledoni under their leader Calgagis. the engagement. The auxiliary front. In a rare move, Agricola placed his 8,000 auxiliaries in the front line, keeping his Roman legions in reserve behind the fortifications. The Highland Charge. The Caledonians held the higher ground. They used long, blunt-ended swords and small shields, which proved ineffective against the stabbing tactics of the Batavian and Tundrian auxiliaries in close quarters. The Cavalry Envelopment. As the Caledonians tried to bypass the auxiliary line to strike the Roman flanks, Agricola unleashed 4 squadrons of cavalry that had been kept in reserve. They rode around the main body and struck the Caledonians from the rear. Consequences. While Agricola won the battle, the conquest of Scotland was never fully realized. The withdrawal. Domitian, the emperor at the time, recalled Agricola to Rome and withdrew troops to the Danube frontier, leaving the north of Britain unconquered. Hadrian's Wall. Decades later, the Emperor Hadrian would formalize this limit by building his famous 73-mile wall, marking the final northern boundary of the Roman world. Britain would remain a Roman province for over 300 years, but it would always be a frontier land, requiring a massive military presence to hold the line against the unconquered tribes of the north. The Dacian Wars, the zenith of empire, 101 to 106 CE. At the dawn of the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire reached its most powerful states under the soldier emperor Trajan. However, across the Danube lay the kingdom of Dacia, modern-day Romania, a wealthy and sophisticated power led by the brilliant king Decebalus. Dacia was a thorn in Rome's side. It possessed rich gold and silver mines, a formidable army, and a king who had humiliated Rome during the reign of Domitian by forcing the empire to pay an annual subsidy in exchange for peace. To Trajan, this peace was an intolerable insult. He resolved to extinguish Dacia as a kingdom and convert it into a Roman province. The First Dacian War, 101 to 102 CE. Trajan assembled the largest strike force seen since the days of Augustus, nearly 150,000 men. The Romans crossed the Danube at Viminatium using a massive bridge of boats. The Battle of Tapae, 101 CE. The two armies met at the Iron Gates of Transylvania. The Forks. The Romans encountered a terrifying new weapon, the Dacian Forks. This was a two-handed scythe with a curved blade that could hook over a Roman shield and split a helmet or sever an arm with a single blow. Roman adaptation. The Romans were forced to modify their equipment mid-campaign. They added crossbars, crucius, to their helmets for extra reinforcement, and began wearing segmented arm guards, manicae, to protect against the Forks. The storm. A violent thunderstorm broke during the battle. Trajan interpreted this as Jupiter's support for Rome. The legions pushed through the mud and drove Decebalus back to his mountain strongholds. The Second Dacian War and the Siege of Sarmisegetusa Regia, 105 to 106 CE. Decebalus broke the peace treaty of 102 CE, prompting Trajan to return for a final war of annihilation. To ensure a permanent connection to the theater of war, Trajan commissioned the architect Apollodorus of Damascus to build a permanent stone bridge over the Danube, the longest in the world for over 1,000 years. The Siege of the Capital. The Romans moved in a multi-pronged assault toward the Dacian capital, Sarmisegetusa Regia, located high in the Orestia Mountains. The Circumvallation. The Romans utilized their engineering superiority, building a series of forts and walls to encircle the mountain fortress. The water supply. Roman engineers discovered and destroyed the ceramic pipes that carried water into the city. The sack. Faced with thirst and the relentless Roman siege engines, the city fell. Decebalus fled into the mountains, pursued by Roman cavalry. Before he could be captured, he committed suicide by cutting his own throat, a scene immortalized on Trajan's column. Consequences: the gold of Dacia. The conquest of Dacia was perhaps the most profitable war in Roman history. The loot: Rome seized an estimated 165,000 kilograms of gold and 331,000 kilograms of silver from the Dacian royal treasury. This wealth funded the most lavish building program in Rome's history, including Trajan's Forum and Market. The empire's peak. This victory extended the Roman border deep into the Carpathian Mountains. Under Trajan, the empire would soon reach its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Scottish Highlands. Cultural legacy. The Latin language took such deep root in the region that the modern country, Romania, still bears the name of the empire that conquered it. The turning point. With the Dacian gold, Rome appeared invincible, yet Trajan's final campaigns in the east against the Parthians would stretch the Roman supply lines to their breaking point, signaling that the era of expansion was finally drawing to a close.
The Roman-Parthian Wars, the Desert Frontier, 53 BCE to 217 CE. While Rome had conquered the Mediterranean and the forests of Gaul, they faced a different kind of adversary to the east. The Parthian Empire, successors to the Persians, were masters of a style of warfare that frustrated the heavy Roman legions for centuries. Unlike the tribal Gauls or the stationary phalanxes of Greece, the Parthians were an empire of horsemen, utilizing the vast open spaces of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau to negate Roman strength. The disaster at Carrhae, 53 BCE. The first major encounter remains one of the most famous defeats in Roman history. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome and a member of the First Triumvirate, sought military glory to match Caesar and Pompey. He invaded Parthia with 7 legions. The Parthian composition. The Parthian commander, Surena, led an army entirely of cavalry, 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts, armored heavy cavalry. The tactical loop. Near the town of Carrhae, the Roman legions formed a massive square. The Parthian horse archers circled them, raining down arrows. When the Romans waited for the archers to run out of ammunition, they saw a camel train of 1,000 animals arriving to resupply the Parthian quivers. The Parthian shot. If the Roman light troops charged, the Parthians would gallop away while turning in their saddles to fire accurately backward, the origin of the term Parthian shot. The massacre. Crassus's son was killed in a failed countercharge. Eventually, the Roman square collapsed. Crassus was killed during a parley. Legend says the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat to mock his greed. Trajan's Eastern Triumph, 115 to 117 CE. It was the Emperor Trajan who finally sought a permanent solution to the Parthian threat. Following his success in Dacia, he launched a massive invasion of Mesopotamia. The capture of Ctesiphon. Trajan's legion successfully marched down the Tigris and Euphrates, capturing the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon. He even reached the Persian Gulf, famously lamenting that he was too old to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. The overextension. Trajan had conquered more than Rome could hold. As soon as he turned back, massive revolts broke out in his rear. Trajan died on the journey back to Rome, and his successor, Hadrian, made the pragmatic decision to abandon the new eastern provinces and return the border to the Euphrates. The Severan campaigns and the siege of Hatra. Under the Severan dynasty, late 2nd century, the wars intensified. The Emperor Septimius Severus sacked Ctesiphon again in 198 CE, but he was twice defeated by the desert city of Hatra. The defense of Hatra. Hatra was a fortified caravan city that utilized human-sized bows and bitumen fire, an early form of Greek fire, to burn Roman siege engines. Severus's soldiers, suffering from heat and lack of water, eventually mutinied, forcing the emperor to retreat. Consequences. The rise of the Sassanids.
The centuries of warfare with Rome eventually exhausted the Parthian Empire. In 224 CE, they were overthrown by the Sassanid Persians, a much more aggressive and centralized dynasty. A new scale of war. The Sassanids were not just raiders, they were empire builders. They captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, using him, according to some accounts, as a footstool for King Shapur I. The defensive shift. Rome was forced to move its primary military focus from the Rhine to the east, leading to the eventual rise of Constantinople as the new capital of the empire. The buffer states. The war centered heavily on control of Armenia, which served as a vital buffer state between the two superpowers. The desert frontier proved that even at its zenith, Rome could not be a truly global hegemon. For every mile they gained in the east, the cost in gold and blood grew exponentially. The Marcomannic Wars, the First Great Northern Crisis, 166 to 180 CE. For decades, the Pax Romana had largely held, but by the mid-2nd century, the pressure on the northern frontiers reached a breaking point. Under the reign of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire faced an unprecedented humanitarian and military disaster. A massive migration of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Iazyges, driven by pressure from tribes further north, surged across the Danube. This was no longer a war of conquest like Trajan's. It was a desperate defensive struggle for the survival of the heart of the empire. The Great Breakthrough and the Plague. In 166 CE, the Germanic tribes shattered the Roman defenses and did something no enemy had done in nearly 300 years. They invaded Italy. They besieged the city of Aquileia, sending shockwaves through Rome. To make matters worse, the returning Eastern legions brought back the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, which decimated the Roman population and the military. Marcus Aurelius, a man who preferred philosophy to war, was forced to sell the imperial treasures, jewels, silk robes, and gold vessels to fund the raising of new legions. He even recruited slaves and gladiators into the ranks to fill the gaps left by the plague. The War in the Mud and Ice. The fighting took place in the frozen marshes and dense forests along the Danube. It was a brutal, total war that lasted 14 years. The Romans had to build a chain of more than 3,000 forts and watchtowers to regain control. The Miracle of the Rhine, 162 CE. During a campaign against the Quadi, the 12th Legion, Fulminata, was surrounded and cut off from water. The soldiers were dying of thirst and exhaustion in the summer heat, while the Quadi prepared for the final slaughter. The event, according to both Roman accounts and the reliefs on the column of Marcus Aurelius, a sudden massive thunderstorm broke. The result? The Romans caught the rain in their shields and helmets to drink, while the lightning strikes terrified the Quadi and threw their lines into chaos. The Romans rallied and broke the encirclement. The Sarmatian cavalry and the frozen river. The most difficult opponents were the Iazyges, a Sarmatian tribe of nomadic heavy cavalry. They fought with long lances and wore scale armor that covered both horse and rider. The battle on the frozen river. In one of the most unique engagements in Roman history, the Iazyges attacked the Romans on the frozen surface of the Danube. The Roman tactic, realizing they could not keep their footing on the ice to use their shields normally, the legionaries knelt on their cloaks or braced their shields on the ice to create a stable platform. They grabbed the Sarmatians' lances and pulled them down, using their short swords in the resulting melee. The Roman discipline won out against the sliding, unstable cavalry. Consequences: the beginning of the end. Marcus Aurelius died at the front in Vindobona, modern Vienna, in 180 CE. His death marked the end of the Pax Romana. The settlement policy. For the first time, Rome began settling large numbers of barbarians within the empire's borders to repopulate the plague-thin lands and provide recruits for the army. This would eventually lead to the Germanization of the Roman military.
The economic strain. The cost of the Marcomannic Wars permanently damaged the Roman economy, leading to a debasement of the currency. The limes. The frontier was restored, but it was now a militarized zone that required the constant presence of the emperor. The era of a peaceful civilian-led Rome was over. The Marcomannic Wars were a dark omen. They proved that the barbarian world was no longer a collection of disjointed tribes, but a mounting tide that the Roman walls could not hold forever. The crisis of the 3rd century and the Palmyrene War, 235 to 275 CE. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was on the verge of total collapse. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, saw the empire besieged by internal civil wars, hyperinflation, the plague, and relentless foreign invasions. At one point, the empire fractured into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrian Empire in the east, and the shrunken Roman core in Italy and the Balkans. The restoration of the Roman world fell to a series of soldier emperors from the Illyrian provinces. The most prominent among them was Aurelian, a strict disciplinarian known by his troops as manus ad ferrum, hand on sword. The rise of Zenobia and the East. While Rome was distracted by Germanic invasions, the city of Palmyra, a wealthy caravan hub in the Syrian desert, had grown into a superpower. Following the death of her husband, Odeodatus, Queen Zenobia seized control. She was a woman of immense intellect and ambition, claiming descent from Cleopatra. Zenobia did not merely rebel, she conquered. Her army seized Egypt, Rome's primary grain source, as well as Syria and much of Asia Minor. She declared her son Augustus, effectively challenging Rome for the title of the true Roman Empire. Aurelian's Eastern Campaign, 272 CE. Aurelian, having secured the Danubian frontier, marched east to reclaim the lost provinces. He was a master of rapid movement and logistical planning. The Battle of Imae. The first major clash occurred near Antioch. Zenobia's army relied heavily on the Klebaneri, super heavy cavalry armored from head to toe in scale mail, riding armored horses. The feigned retreat. Aurelian knew his lighter Roman cavalry could not withstand a direct charge from the Palmyrian iron men. He ordered his horsemen to engage briefly and then flee in mock panic. The exhaustion. The Palmyrian cavalry, weighed down by nearly 100 pounds of armor each, pursued the Romans across the baking Syrian plain. In the intense heat, the heavy horses and riders quickly became exhausted. The counterattack. Once the Palmyrians were scattered and panting for air, Aurelian's cavalry turned around and slaughtered the immobilized riders. The Battle of Emesa. Zenobia retreated to Emesa with a second, larger army. Again, the heavy cavalry was the centerpiece. The tactical innovation. Aurelian observed that the Palmyrian armor was vulnerable to blunt force. He equipped a contingent of Palestinian auxiliaries with heavy wooden clubs and maces. The result? While the Roman swords struggled to pierce the scales, the clubs crushed the helmets and limbs of the Palmyrian nobles. Zenobia fled across the desert toward the Euphrates, but she was captured by Roman light cavalry just as she was boarding a boat to seek Persian aid. The Siege of Palmyra. The city of Palmyra itself was a formidable desert fortress. Aurelian conducted a grueling siege, harassed by Saracen, Bedouin, raiders, and the blistering sun. The surrender. Deprived of their queen and their water, the city opened its gates. Aurelian initially showed mercy, but when the city revolted again a year later, he returned and leveled it to the ground. Palmyra would never recover its former glory. The Restoration of the West, 274 CE. After subduing the East, Aurelian turned to the Gallic Empire. At the Battle of Chalons, the Gallic usurper, Tetricus, weary of his own rebellious troops, actually negotiated his own defeat, surrendering to Aurelian in exchange for his life. Consequences: Restitutor Orbis. In less than 5 years, Aurelian had reunified the fractured world. The title:
The Senate granted him the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. The Aurelian Walls. Despite his victories, Aurelian knew Rome was no longer safe. He constructed a massive 12-mile brick and concrete wall around the city of Rome, the first time the capital had been fortified since the days of Hannibal. The Sol Invictus. He promoted the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a unifying state religion to provide a single cultural focus for the diverse empire. Aurelian was assassinated by his own officers in a misunderstanding in 275 CE, but his work ensured the empire survived for another 2 centuries. He had proven that the Roman military, if led by a single capable hand, was still the most formidable force in the world. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge and the Rise of Constantine, 312 CE. After the restoration of the world by Aurelian, the empire underwent a radical administrative overhaul under Diocletian, who established the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. This system divided the empire into East and West, each governed by an Augustus and a junior Caesar. However, the system relied on the cooperation of its rulers, a quality that evaporated as soon as Diocletian abdicated. The result was a series of civil wars that culminated in a battle that would fundamentally change the religious and political landscape of Western civilization. The contenders. By 312 CE, the Western Empire was contested by 2 men, Constantine, the son of the former emperor Constantius Chlorus, and Maxentius, the son of the former emperor Maximian. Constantine, commanding the battle-hardened legions of Britain and Gaul, was a brilliant tactician who emphasized speed. Maxentius, holding Rome, Maxentius possessed the prestige of the capital and the formidable Praetorian Guard. He had fortified the city and held enough grain to survive a long siege. The vision and the sign. As Constantine marched through Italy, he realized he was outnumbered. On the eve of the battle, according to the Christian historians like Tantius and Eusebius, Constantine experienced a divine vision. He reportedly saw a cross of light in the sky with the Greek words enthutonika, in this sign conquer. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint a new symbol on their shields, the Chi Rho, a monogram representing the first 2 letters of Christ. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time, a Roman army was marching under a non-pagan religious banner. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius made a fatal tactical error. Instead of staying behind the impregnable Aurelian walls, he decided to cross the Tiber River to meet Constantine in open battle. He positioned his army on the narrow plain in front of the Milvian Bridge. The Pontoon Bridge. Because the original stone bridge was partially destroyed to prevent an easy crossing, Maxentius constructed a temporary wooden pontoon bridge to move his troops across. The Cavalry Clash. Constantine unleashed his superior Gallic cavalry against Maxentius's wings. The Roman and Moorish horsemen under Maxentius were driven back into the river. The Infantry Grind. Constantine's veteran legions, inspired by the new standard and their commander's presence, pushed forward with a ferocity the urban-based troops of Maxentius could not match. The Collapse. The Maxentian line shattered. Thousands of soldiers panicked and tried to flee back across the Tiber. The wooden pontoon bridge, overloaded by the weight of retreating men and horses, collapsed. Maxentius, weighed down by his heavy armor, fell into the river and drowned. Consequences. The Edict of Milan. Constantine entered Rome in triumph, the severed head of Maxentius displayed on a spear. Religious revolution. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting total religious tolerance and ending the state persecution of Christians. The end of the Praetorians. Constantine permanently disbanded the Praetorian Guard, the kingmakers who had plagued Roman politics for centuries, and destroyed their barracks. Constantinople. Sensing that Rome was too far from the troubled frontiers, Constantine began building a new Rome on the site of Byzantium, Constantinople. This shifted the empire's center of gravity to the east, where it would survive for another millennium. The battle was more than a military victory. It was the hinge upon which the Roman Empire swung from the classical age into the medieval one. But as the empire embraced a new faith, the ancient walls on the Danube were beginning to crumble under a pressure the Romans could no longer contain. The Battle of Hadrianople, the beginning of the end, 378 CE. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire faced a demographic crisis of a scale never before seen. A new power from the depths of Central Asia, the Huns, had moved into Eastern Europe, creating a domino effect of fleeing tribes. The Visigoths, Western Goths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, appeared on the banks of the Danube in 376 CE, pleading for asylum within the Roman Empire. The Emperor Valens granted them entry, hoping to use them as farmers and recruits. However, the greed and corruption of Roman provincial officials led to a catastrophic famine among the refugees. Driven to desperation, the Goths rose in rebellion, transforming from a band of refugees into a hardened army of vengeance wandering the Balkans. The road to Hadrianople. In 378 CE, Valens marched from Constantinople to confront the Goths near the city of Hadrianople, modern Edirne, Turkey. Valens was anxious for a victory to match that of his nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, who was currently en route with reinforcements. Despite warnings from his scouts that the Gothic numbers were larger than expected, Valens decided to attack without waiting for Gratian. The Goths had established a lager, a massive defensive circle of wagons that served as a mobile fortress. Inside the circle were their families and supplies. Outside, their infantry waited. The battle, August 9, 378 CE. The battle began prematurely due to a lack of discipline among the Roman skirmishers. It was one of the hottest days of the year, and the Roman legions had been marching for hours under a blazing sun without water. The Roman assault. The Roman left wing pushed the Gothic infantry back toward the wagon circle. For a moment, it seemed the legions might breach the fortification. The return of the cavalry. At the height of the struggle, the Gothic cavalry, the Gruthungi, which had been away foraging, suddenly returned to the field. Like a thunderbolt, they struck the exposed Roman left flank. The crush. The Roman infantry was pushed together so tightly that men could not raise their arms to strike. The dust and the heat obscured everything. The Roman line, usually so flexible, became a panicked mass. The massacre. The Goths broke through. Of the 30,000 Roman troops, 2/3 were killed, including many of the empire's most experienced officers and the elite palace guards. The death of the emperor. The emperor's fate remains one of the great mysteries of the era. Some accounts claim he was struck by an arrow while fighting among the common soldiers. Others suggest he fled to a nearby farmhouse, which the Goths, unaware the emperor was inside, set on fire, burning him alive. His body was never found. Consequences. A wound that never healed. The historian Aemilius Marcellinus called Hadrianople the greatest disaster since Cannae. Its impact was psychological as much as military. The death of the legion. The traditional Roman heavy infantry, which had dominated the world for 700 years, never truly recovered from the loss of its veteran corps at Hadrianople. The rise of the cavalry. This battle signaled a shift toward the importance of heavy cavalry in medieval warfare. The foederati system. The new emperor, Theodosius I, was forced to make peace with the Goths by allowing them to settle within the empire as independent allies, foederati, under their own leaders. This created a state within a state, placing a permanent, autonomous barbarian army in the heart of the Roman world. The Goths were no longer outside the gates, they were inside, and they now knew that the Roman legions could be beaten in a field of open battle. The clock had begun to tick for the city of Rome itself. The sack of Rome and the fall of the West, 410 to 476 CE. The disaster at Hadrianople had punctured the myth of Roman invincibility. For the first time in centuries, the barbarian tribes within the empire realized that the Roman state was a hollow shell. held together more by reputation than by actual military might. This final phase of the Western Roman Empire was not characterized by a single great war, but by a series of sieges, betrayals, and the eventual disintegration of central authority. The rise of Alaric and the Visigoths. The Goths, settled within the empire as Thorirati, were led by Alaric, a man who had served as a Roman officer and understood the inner workings of the imperial court. Alaric did not necessarily want to destroy Rome. He wanted a high-ranking military command and a secure homeland for his people. When the Western Emperor Honorius, a weak and paranoid ruler cowering behind the marshes of Ravenna, refused to meet his demands and executed the Roman general Stilicho, the only man capable of stopping the Goths, Alaric marched on Rome. The sack of 410 CE. For the first time in 800 years, since the Gauls under Brennus in 390 BCE, the city of Rome was breached. On the night of August 24, 410 CE, the Salarian Gate was opened from within. The 3 days. The Goths plundered the city for 3 days, while Alaric, a Christian, ordered his men to respect the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul. The rest of the city was stripped of its wealth. The psychological shock. The physical damage to the city was relatively minor, but the psychological blow was terminal. Across the empire, people were horrified. St. Jerome famously wrote from Bethlehem, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, 451 CE. The final great battle of the Western Empire occurred not against the Goths, but against the far more alien threat, Attila the Hun. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila led a massive confederation of Huns, Ostrogoths, and Gepids into Gaul. To stop him, a Roman general named Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, achieved the diplomatic miracle. He forged an alliance with his former enemies, the Visigoths, under King Theodoric I, to face the Huns. The engagement. The battle near Chalons was a chaotic, bloody struggle. It was a clash of cultures. The Roman-Gothic alliance represented the settled Mediterranean world, while the Huns represented the nomadic fury of the steppe. The result, Theodoric was killed in a cavalry charge, but the Huns were repulsed. Attila withdrew, and though he would invade Italy the following year, his momentum was broken. This was the last time a Roman army, even one mostly composed of barbarians, successfully defended the West. The final collapse, 476 CE. By the mid-5th century, the Western Emperor was little more than a puppet of the Germanic generals who commanded the army. The empire had lost its provinces, Spain to the Suebi and Vandals, Gaul to the Franks and Visigoths, and Africa to the Vandals. In 476 CE, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, leading a revolt of mercenary troops, deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager ironically named Romulus Augustulus, combining the names of Rome's founder and its first emperor. The act. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was enough for both halves of the empire. The aftermath. Odoacer styled himself King of Italy. The Western Roman Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a political entity. Long-term consequences. The fall of the West did not mean the end of Roman culture, the Byzantine survival. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine, would survive for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law and Greek literature. The birth of Europe. The Germanic kingdoms that rose from the ruins of the West would eventually evolve into the nations of modern Europe, France, England, and Spain, all heavily influenced by the Roman legal, religious, and linguistic foundations left behind. The story of the Roman wars began with a small city-state fighting for a few acres of Italian soil and ended with a global empire whose very name became synonymous with civilization itself. Though the legions eventually stopped marching, the Roman way of law, engineering, and government remains the bedrock of the Western world today. The Wars of Justinian, the dream of Renovatio Imperii, 527 to 565 CE. While the Western Roman Empire had officially fallen in 476 CE, the Roman spirit and legal structure survived in the East, centered at Constantinople. In 527 CE, a man of peasant origins named Justinian I ascended the throne. He possessed a singular, obsessive vision, the Renovatio Imperii, or the restoration of the empire. He sought to reconquer the lost western provinces from the Germanic kingdoms and return the Mediterranean to a Roman lake. To achieve this, he relied on the greatest military genius of the age, Belisarius. The Vandalic War, the Lightning Strike, 533 to 534 CE. The first target was the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals, who had sacked Rome in 455 CE, were now seen as decadent and divided. Belisarius landed in Africa with a modest but elite force of 15,000 men, including the terrifying Bucellari, private household guards, and Hunnic horse archers. The Battle of Ad Decimum. The Vandal king Gelimer attempted to trap the Romans at the 10th milestone, Ad Decimum, from Carthage. The failed coordination. The Vandal plan required 3 separate forces to strike simultaneously. Due to the lack of signaling, the forces arrived piecemeal. The Roman discipline. When Gelimer's brother was killed in a preliminary skirmish, the king was overcome with grief and halted his advance to bury him. Belisarius seized this moment of hesitation and launched a decisive cavalry charge. The result: the Vandal army shattered. Carthage fell within days, and the Vandal kingdom, once the terror of the seas, was extinguished in a single campaign. The Gothic War, the long agony of Italy, 535 to 554 CE. The reconquest of Italy from the Ostrogoths proved far more grueling. It was a war of sieges, starvation, and shifting loyalties that lasted nearly 2 decades. The Siege of Rome, 537 to 538 CE. Belisarius captured Rome with only 5,000 men. He was immediately besieged by a massive Ostrogothic army under King Vitiges, estimated at 45,000. The Engineering War. The Goths cut the aqueducts, stopping the city's mills. Belisarius responded by anchoring floating mills in the Tiber, powered by the river's current. The Repulse. Despite overwhelming numbers, the Goths could not breach the Aurelian walls. Belisarius's horse archers conducted constant sorties, picking off Goths from a distance, a tactic the Gothic heavy cavalry had no answer for. The rise of Totila and the Battle of Tagine, 552 CE. After Belisarius was recalled due to Justinian's paranoia, a new Gothic king, Totila, reclaimed most of Italy. Justinian sent a new army under the elderly eunuch general Narses. Narses formation. Narses deployed his infantry in a hollow crescent with 8,000 archers on the wings. The Gothic charge. Totila, believing the Roman center was weak, ordered a direct massed cavalry charge. The crossfire. As the Goths charged, they were caught in a lethal crossfire from the Roman archers on both sides. The horses were slaughtered before they even reached the Roman line. The end of the Ostrogoths. Totila was killed in the rout. Italy was technically Roman again, but it was a scarred, depopulated land. The cost of restoration. Justinian's wars were successful in the short term, but they came at a horrific price. The Plague of Justinian. In 541 CE, the first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague hit the empire, killing an estimated 25% of the population. This robbed the empire of the manpower needed to hold the reconquered lands. The exhaustion of the treasury. The wars in the west and the constant subsidies paid to the Sassanid Persians in the east drained the Roman gold reserves. The strategic vacuum. By focusing so heavily on Italy and Africa, Justinian left the Balkan and eastern frontiers vulnerable to new threats, the Lombards, the Avars, and eventually the rise of Islam. The final horizon. The wars of Justinian represent the final blaze of the ancient Roman candle. For a brief moment, the map of the Mediterranean looked as it had in the days of Augustus, but the world had changed too much. The Roman Empire of the East, now increasingly Greek in character, would survive as the Byzantine Empire, but the dream of a unified Latin-speaking Mediterranean empire was buried with Justinian in 565 CE.
The Byzantine-Sassanid War of 602 to 628, the last great war of antiquity. The 7th century opened with the Roman, Byzantine, and Sassanid Persian empires locked in a struggle of such scale and duration that it is often called the First World War of the Middle Ages. This was no longer a skirmish over border forts or Armenian gold. It was a total, apocalyptic conflict that brought both civilizations to the brink of extinction. The collapse of the East. The war began when the Byzantine Emperor Maurice was murdered in a coup by a centurion named Phocas. The Persian king Khosrow II, who had been restored to his throne years earlier with Maurice's help, used the murder as a pretext for a war of vengeance. Under the brilliant Persian generals Sharbaraz and Shahin, the Sassanids achieved what the Parthians never could: the fall of the Levant. By 614 CE, Jerusalem fell. The Persians burned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and carried away the true cross, the most sacred relic of Christendom, to Ctesiphon. The conquest of Egypt. By 619 CE, the Persians had conquered Egypt, cutting off Constantinople's grain supply. The threshold of Europe. Persian armies reached Chalcedon, looking across the Bosporus at the walls of Constantinople itself. The rise of Heraclius and the Roman counteroffensive. In 610 CE, a new emperor, Heraclius, arrived from Africa to depose Phocas. He found an empire in ruins. For years, he rebuilt the army, melted down church plate to mint coins, and transformed the war into a religious crusade, the first of its kind. In 622 CE, Heraclius did the unthinkable. Leaving his capital under the protection of the Patriarch and the city's massive walls, he took his army by sea and landed in the rear of the Persian forces. The Battle of Nineveh, 627 CE. After years of campaigning in the Caucasus and Anatolia, Heraclius marched into the Persian heartland. Near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, he met the Persian army under General Razad. The personal duel. Tradition holds that Heraclius, a massive man and skilled warrior, engaged in single combat with the Persian general and decapitated him with a single sword stroke. The fog of battle. The engagement took place in a thick morning mist. The Roman heavy cavalry, utilizing the kontos, heavy lance, broke the Persian center. The Persian collapse. The Sassanid army, which had not seen a Roman force in their homeland for generations, was utterly destroyed. The Great Siege of Constantinople, 626 CE. While Heraclius was in Persia, the Sassanids and their allies, the Avars, launched a coordinated assault on Constantinople. The two-front siege. The Avars attacked the land walls with massive siege towers, while the Persians waited on the Asian shore. The naval victory. The Byzantine navy destroyed the Avar fleet of dugout canoes, preventing the Persians from crossing the Bosporus. The invincible Theodosian walls held firm. The Avars retreated, and the Persian threat to the capital evaporated. The Peace of Exhaustion. In 628 CE, Khosrow II was overthrown and murdered by his own son. The new Persian king sued for peace. The terms? The Persians agreed to return all conquered territories, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, and, most importantly, the True Cross. The triumph. Heraclius returned to Jerusalem in 630 CE to personally restore the True Cross to the Holy Sepulchre. He was at the height of his glory, the savior of the Roman world. Consequences? The vacuum. The war had ended in a total Roman victory, but it was a Pyrrhic one. Exhaustion. Both empires were militarily and financially bankrupt. Their populations were decimated, and their fortifications were in disrepair. Religious strife. Years of Persian occupation had deepened the sectarian rifts between the central church in Constantinople and the Christians of Egypt and Syria. The shadow from the south. Nor had Heraclius nor the Persians realized that while they had been tearing each other apart, a new power had unified the Arabian Peninsula. Only a few years after the peace, the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate emerged from the desert. The exhausted Romans and Persians, who had fought for 26 years to maintain their borders, would now face a threat that would sweep away the Sassanids forever and strip Rome of her eastern provinces for good.
The Battle of Yarmouk, the loss of the Levant, 636 CE. In the wake of the exhausting war with Persia, the Roman Empire was a hollowed-out shell. Heraclius had barely begun the monumental task of rebuilding the administration in the east when the desert storm of the Rashidun Caliphate broke upon the frontier. Driven by the new faith of Islam and commanded by the military genius Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of Allah, the Arab armies moved with a speed and zeal that the weary Roman bureaucracy could not comprehend. The Gathering of the Titans. By 636 CE, the Arabs had already seized Damascus. Heraclius, realizing that his hard-won peace was at stake, organized a massive counteroffensive. He assembled an army of approximately 80,000 to 100,000 men, a multi-ethnic force of Greeks, Armenians, and Christian Arab auxiliaries, the Ghassanids. The command was given to the general Vahan. The Arab force was significantly smaller, likely around 25,000 to 40,000 veterans, but they possessed a singular tactical advantage. They were light, mobile, and perfectly adapted to the scorching heat of the Syrian summer. The terrain, the Yarmouk River. The battle took place on a high plateau south of the Sea of Galilee, bordered by the deep ravines of the Yarmouk River. For 6 days, the two armies engaged in a series of skirmishes and shifting maneuvers. The battle sequence, August 15th through 20th, 636 CE. The Roman push. In the early days, the Roman heavy infantry and cavalry pushed the Arab lines back to their camp. On several occasions, the Arab retreat was only stopped by their own women, who stood at the back of the camp and shamed the warriors into returning to the fight. The dust storm. On the final day, a fierce southern wind, the Khamsin, blew clouds of blinding sand and dust directly into the faces of the Romans. The Khalid maneuver. Khalid ibn al-Walid identified a gap that had opened between the Roman cavalry and infantry. He launched a concentrated cavalry charge that drove the Roman horsemen off the field, leaving the infantry unprotected. The ravine trap. The Roman infantry, blinded by the dust and pressed by the Arab charge, were pushed back toward the steep cliffs of the Yarmouk. The retreat turned into a catastrophe as thousands of legionaries fell to their deaths in the ravines or were cut down in the chaotic crush. The farewell to Syria. The defeat was absolute. The veteran core of the Eastern Roman army was gone. When the news reached Heraclius in Antioch, he realized that the Levant was lost. He famously looked toward the south and cried out, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria, my fair province. Thou art now an infidel's." Consequences, the shrinking empire. The Battle of Yarmouk is arguably one of the most decisive battles in human history. The fall of Jerusalem. Without an army to defend it, Jerusalem surrendered in 637 CE to the Caliph Umar ibn al-As. Rome had lost its wealthiest provinces in less than a decade. The strategic retreat. The empire was forced to retreat behind the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, modern Turkey. This became the permanent frontier for the next 400 years. The transition to Byzantium. This loss forced the state to fully militarize. The old Roman administrative system was replaced by the themes, military districts where soldiers were given land in exchange for hereditary service. The Latin-speaking Roman Empire had finally, irrevocably, become the Byzantine Empire. The Romans had survived the Persians, the Goths, and the Huns, but the world was now divided. The Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. It was a contested sea between the cross and the crescent. The sieges of Constantinople, the survival of the remnant, 674 to 718 CE.
By the late 7th century, the Roman Empire, now reduced to its Anatolian heartland, parts of the Balkans, and fragments of Italy, faced an existential threat. The Umayyad Caliphate, having consolidated its hold over the former Roman East, turned its sights on the Queen of Cities, Constantinople. The Arab leaders realized that as long as the Roman capital stood, their conquests would never be secure. What followed were two of the most significant sieges in human history, where the fate of Europe hung on the strength of Roman walls and a secret weapon of terrifying power. The First Arab Siege, 674 to 678 CE. The Caliph Muawiyah I launched a sophisticated multi-year naval campaign. The Arab fleet established a base at Cyzicus, just across the Sea of Marmara, and used it to launch seasonal attacks against the city's seawalls every spring and summer for 5 years. The secret weapon, Greek fire. During the siege, a Syrian Christian refugee named Kallinikos brought an invention to the emperor Constantine IV, Greek fire. The composition, the exact formula, was a state secret so closely guarded that it was eventually lost to history. It was likely a mixture of naphtha, quicklime, and sulfur. The delivery. It was launched through pressurized scythons or flamethrowers mounted on the prows of Byzantine dromons, warships. The effect? Crucially, Greek fire burned on water and was nearly impossible to extinguish. The Roman fleet used this substance to incinerate the Arab navy in the Sea of Marmara. Disheartened by their losses and the impregnability of the Theodosian walls, the Arab forces eventually withdrew, and Muawiyah signed a 30-year truce. The Second Arab Siege, 717 to 718 CE. The most dangerous moment came 40 years later. The Caliphate dispatched a gargantuan force, an army of 80,000 men under Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, and a fleet of 1,800 ships. The Emperor Leo III the Isaurian, a brilliant but ruthless general, had just seized the throne and found the city's granaries nearly empty. The triple defense, the Theodosian walls. On land, the 3-layered walls punctuated by 96 towers proved impassable. The Arab army was forced to dig their own trenches to protect themselves from Roman sorties. The massive chain. To protect the Golden Harbor, the city's inner harbor, the Romans stretched a massive iron chain across the water's surface, preventing the Arab fleet from flanking the city. The bitter winter. 717 CE saw one of the coldest winters in recorded history. Snow covered the ground for 100 days. The Arab troops, unaccustomed to the climate, died by the thousands from frostbite and famine. Legend says they were eventually forced to eat their own camels and horses. The final blow. In the spring of 718 CE, Greek fire was once again unleashed upon the Arab supply fleets. Simultaneously, the Bulgars, acting as Roman allies, struck the starving Arab land army from the rear. The siege was abandoned. Of the 1,800 ships that set out from the Levant, only 5 reportedly returned. Consequences: the shield of Christendom. The failure of the sieges of Constantinople had a profound impact on the development of the West. The wall in the East. Had Constantinople fallen in the 717 CE, there was no organized power in Europe capable of stopping the Caliphate. The Roman survival allowed the nascent kingdoms of the West, like the Franks, to develop in relative isolation. The Dark Age recovery. The empire began to recover, developing the thematic system into a highly efficient defensive machine. The Roman state would endure for another 7 centuries, transitioning into a medieval Greek empire that preserved the heritage of the Caesars. The end of ancient ambition. This era marked the final end of the universal empire. Rome was now one of many competing powers, a resilient remnant of a glorious past, holding the line between the East and the West.
The Battle of Manzikert and the Twilight of the East, 1071 CE. Following the survival of Constantinople in the 8th century, the Byzantine Empire experienced a remarkable Macedonian Renaissance. For over 200 years, warriors like Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, expanded the borders back into the Balkans and deep into Armenia. By the mid-11th century, however, a new and devastating power emerged from the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks.
Unlike the Arabs, who had sought to annex the Roman state, the Turks were nomadic conquerors whose swift horse archers threatened to turn the Anatolian plateau, the agricultural and military heart of the empire, into a grazing land. The Gathering Storm. In 1071 CE, the Emperor Romanos IV Theogenes, a professional soldier who had risen to the throne to save the state from military decay, gathered a massive multi-ethnic army. It was a grand but fragile force, composed of Byzantine regulars, Norman knights, Frankish mercenaries, and Turkic Pecheneg horsemen. Romanos intended to secure the eastern fortresses once and for all, and neutralize the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan. The Battle of Manzikert. The confrontation took place near the fortress of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. Romanos made a critical strategic error by splitting his forces, sending nearly half his army away on a secondary mission just before the main engagement. The Tactical Sequence, August 26, 1071 CE. The Turkic Tactics. Alp Arslan utilized the classic step tactic of the feigned retreat. As the heavy Roman center pushed forward, the Turkish horse archers retreated in a crescent formation, showering the legions with arrows from the flanks. The Fatal Command. By late afternoon, the Roman infantry was exhausted and out of position. Romanos ordered the army to turn back toward their camp. The Betrayal. In this moment of vulnerability, a political rival of the emperor, Andronicus Ducas, who commanded the reserve line, intentionally spread a rumor that the emperor had been defeated. Instead of covering the retreat, Ducas led the reserves off the field. The Capture. The Seljuks sensed the panic. They turned and swarmed the Roman center. The elite Varangian Guard, the emperor's Viking bodyguards, fought to the last man, but Romanos was wounded and taken prisoner, the first time a Roman emperor had been captured by a Muslim leader. Consequences. The Doorway to Anatolia. The defeat at Manzikert was not a massacre on the scale of Adrianople, but its political and strategic consequences were far more catastrophic. The loss of the heartland. In the civil wars that followed the emperor's capture, the Anatolian defense system collapsed. The Seljuk Turks poured into the interior of Turkey. Within a decade, the empire had lost the very lands that provided its best soldiers and most of its food. The Appeal to the West. Desperate to reclaim Anatolia, the Emperor Alexius I Komnenos eventually sent an appeal to Pope Urban II. This appeal would become the primary catalyst for the First Crusade. The transition to a Mediterranean power. After Manzikert, the empire was no longer a continental superpower. It was increasingly reduced to a coastal state, reliant on the naval power of Venice and Genoa and the arrival of Western knights to hold its remaining territories. Part 27. The Fall of 1453. The Final Siege. The story of the Roman wars, which began in the 8th century BCE with tribal skirmishes in Latium, concludes on the morning of May 29, 1453 CE. By this time, the empire was merely the city of Constantinople and a few fragments of Greece. The final adversary was the 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror. The final defense. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologus, commanded a pitifully small force of roughly 7,000 men against an Ottoman army of 80,000. The innovation of gunpowder. The deciding factor was no longer the sword or the spear, but the great bombards. An engineer named Orban created massive bronze cannons for the Sultan that could fire 600-pound stone balls. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls were crumbling. The final assault. After 53 days of siege, Mehmed II launched a general assault. The Kerkeporta Gate. through a small postern gate left accidentally unbolted, or perhaps through a breach in the St. Romanus section of the wall, the first Janissaries, elite Ottoman troops, broke into the city. The death of the last emperor. Legend has it that Constantine XI, seeing the city was lost, threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the thickest part of the fighting as a common soldier. His body was never identified. The end of the Roman world. At noon on May 29th, Mehmed II entered the Hagia Sophia and ordered it converted into a mosque. The final legacy. The fall of Constantinople is often cited as the end of the Middle Ages. Greek scholars fleeing the city carried ancient Roman and Greek texts to Italy, fueling the Renaissance. The Translatio Imperii. Even after the fall, the Roman idea persisted. The Ottoman sultans took the title Kaiser Irum, Caesar of Rome, and in the north, the Grand Dukes of Moscow claimed the title of Tsar, Caesar, viewing Moscow as the Third Rome. The Roman military machine had lasted for over 2,200 years. It had evolved from bronze-clad hoplites to iron-shielded legionaries to cataphracts and finally to defenders on the walls facing the dawn of the gunpowder age. While the empire eventually perished, its wars shaped the borders, the languages, and the very soul of the modern world.
We have created a playlist called Sleepy Roman Tales. In it, we take you far back in time to an age where the footsteps of Roman soldiers still echo through stone streets. Beneath a darkened sky, the ruins of the Colosseum stand in silence, carrying the weight of a fallen empire. This playlist uncovers the memories of the Roman Empire, stories time tried to erase, but history refused to forget. Close your eyes, slow your breath, and drift into the depths of ancient Rome. We will meet again in one episode of this playlist.